Welcome, curious listeners and restless minds. Let's imagine for a moment a vast stage where the fate of humanity intertwines with the invisible threads of the collective psyche. We find ourselves on the threshold of a fascinating journey, guided by the pen and thoughts of one of the greatest explorers of the human soul, Sigmund Freud. Prepare to dive into a universe where the structures of our civilization and the depths of our being interlace in a complex tapestry of emotions and desires. Civilization and Its Discontents is not merely a title, it's an invitation to decipher the enigmas hidden behind the facade of our social order. Freud, the intrepid navigator of the labyrinths of the unconscious, guides us through a dark forest of cultural tensions, repressed desires, and internal conflicts. Let us imagine together that culture is a vast kingdom where human beings, armed with ideals and norms, attempt to find a balance between their highest aspirations and their most primitive impulses. In this journey, Freud reveals how the heroes and villains of our own minds battle on the stage of civilization. As we listen, we will witness how the great challenges of human existence, aggression, desire, suffering, manifest in our institutions, laws, and relationships. Freud, with his incisive and penetrating style, uncovers the darkest secrets of our culture, illuminating the hidden shadows behind the curtains of our daily lives. So settle in comfortably and prepare to engage in an unparalleled intellectual adventure. Let Freud's words awaken in you a deep and provocative reflection on the true nature of our culture. As each chapter unfolds, we will embark on a journey that defies conventions, explores the depths of the unconscious, and challenges accepted truths. Onward, brave explorers of the human mind. Open your minds and hearts to the bold exploration that Freud offers us. May this journey through the malaise in culture be as intriguing and revealing as life itself. Let's begin this journey together through the cultural labyrinth that Freud so masterfully deciphered. In the vast theatre of human life, with its multiple colors and emotional depths, we encounter an intriguing paradox. While many relentlessly pursue power, wealth, and success, others, removed from the tumult, devote themselves to discovering the true values of life. The contrast between what is superficially admired and what is deeply appreciated offers us a perspective on human complexity and diversity. In this context, the conversation between two thinkers introduces us to a less explored but equally vital aspect of the human mind: the recognition and reflection on what truly nourishes the soul. The discussion between friends, where one finds an echo in the other's reflections on the illusion of religion, while representing the concept of the oceanic feeling, invites us to revisit our own ideas about spirituality and its origin. This oceanic feeling, a sensation of eternity and limitlessness, suggests an understanding of the human mind that goes beyond conventional religious doctrines towards a personal and subjective experience. While it does not promise personal immortality, it is proposed that this feeling is the source of the religious energy that institutions have channeled for centuries. What relationship does this concept have with the quest for power and success in modern society? While most cling to material accomplishments and external recognition, some, through introspection and sincere dialogue, explore an inner wealth that eludes science and defies conventional definitions. The difference between what is publicly admired and what is privately valued shows the diversity of human experience and the complexity of our values. In this introspective conversation, not only are common ideas about religion and spirituality questioned, but the importance of recognizing and respecting the diversity of experiences and beliefs in our society is also emphasized. The difficulty of identifying the oceanic feeling within oneself highlights the tension between intellectual understanding and emotional experience, a central dilemma of the human condition. Ultimately, this exchange between thinkers teaches us that truly understanding human values requires looking beyond the material and the immediate. It invites us to reflect on the fact that within each person exists a universe of feelings and thoughts that, though often hidden, are essential to a complete understanding of the human soul. This exploration of emotional and spiritual depth pushes us to expand our perceptions and value the richness of human experience in all its expressions. Chapter 1. It is impossible to avoid the impression that people often use false criteria of measurement, that they seek power, success, and wealth for themselves, and that they admire these values in others while underestimating what really matters in life. And yet, By making such a general judgment, we run the risk of forgetting how diversified the human world and its mental life are. There are men to whom their contemporaries do not deny admiration, even though their greatness is based on attributes and achievements that are totally foreign to the goals and ideals of the masses. One could easily assume that, after all, it is a minority who appreciates these great men, while the vast majority cares little about them. But probably things are not so simple due to the divergences between people's thoughts and actions and the diversity of their impulses and desires. One of these exceptional people calls himself my friend in the letters he sends me. I had sent him my little book considering religion as an illusion, The Future of an Illusion, 1927, and he replied that he totally agreed with the ideas I had presented, but regretted that I had not sufficiently appreciated the true source of religious feelings. He claims that this source resides in a particular feeling, which he himself has never been without, which he finds confirmed by many others, and assumes is present in millions of people. It is a feeling he would like to call a sensation of eternity, a feeling of infinity, limitlessness, so to speak, oceanic. This feeling, he adds, is purely subjective and not an article of faith. Although it offers no guarantee of personal immortality, it represents the source of the energy exploited by various churches and religious systems, directed toward particular channels, and undoubtedly exhausted by them as well. In his view, one cannot qualify a person as religious solely because of this oceanic feeling, even if they reject all belief in illusion. The opinions expressed by my friend, whom I respect greatly, and to whom I once paid homage by praising the magic of illusion in a poem, have posed many difficulties for me, as I have been unable to discover this oceanic feeling in myself. It is not easy to scientifically examine feelings, but one can always attempt to describe their physiological signs. When this is not possible, and I fear that the oceanic feeling may also defy such characterization, the only option left is to resort to the ideational content most easily associated with the feeling. If I have understood my friend correctly, he is referring to the consolation offered by an original and somewhat eccentric playwright to his hero facing self-inflicted death. That is, a feeling of an indissoluble bond, of being one with the external world as a whole. I realize that this seems to have the nature of an intellectual perception, which is, of course, accompanied only by a nuance of feeling, much like any act of thought of the same magnitude. In my own experience, I've not been able to convince myself of the primary nature of such a feeling, but this does not give me the right to deny that it may indeed occur in other people. The only question to analyze is whether this feeling is properly interpreted and whether it should be considered the origin, the source and the origin of all religious need. I have nothing to suggest that could decisively influence the resolution of this problem. The idea that humans receive a hint of their connection with the world around them through an immediate feeling, one that is from the start oriented towards this purpose, seems so strange and fits so poorly with the structure of our psychology that it is justifiable to attempt to discover a psychoanalytic, that is, a genetic, explanation of this feeling. The following line of thought is suggested. Normally there is nothing we are more certain of than the feeling of our own self, our own ego. This ego presents itself to us as something autonomous and unitary, differentiated from everything else. That this appearance is deceptive, and that on the contrary the self extends inward without any clear boundary into an unconscious mental entity we designate as the ID, which it serves as a facade for, is a discovery first made by psychoanalytic research, which still has much to reveal about the relationship between the ego and the ID. But outwardly, in any case, the ego seems to maintain clear and definite boundaries. There is only one state in which it does not, which is certainly unusual but cannot be stigmatized as pathological. It is the peak of the state of being in love, where the boundary between the ego and the object threatens to disappear. Against all evidence of his senses, a man in love declares that you and I are one, and is willing to behave as if this were a fact, which may temporarily be due to a physiological function, that is, normal, but which must also be susceptible to disruption by pathological processes. Pathology has made us aware of many states in which the boundaries between the ego and the external world become uncertain, or are actually drawn incorrectly. There are cases where certain parts of a person's own body, or even parts of their own mental life, perceptions, thoughts, and feelings, seem foreign to them and do not belong to their ego. There are other cases where a person attributes things from the external world that clearly emanate from their own ego and should be recognized as such. Thus, even the feeling of our own ego is subject to disturbances, and its boundaries are not constant. Further reflection tells us that the feeling of the ego in the adult could not have been the same from the start, but must have undergone a developmental process that, of course, cannot be demonstrated but can be constructed with a good degree of probability. An infant does not distinguish itself from the outside world as the source of the sensations it receives. It learns to do so gradually in response to various stimuli. It must be greatly impressed by the fact that certain sources of excitement, which it will later recognize as its own bodily organs, can provide sensations at any time, while other sources elude it from time to time, among which what it desires most, its mother's breast, does not reappear until it cries in distress. Thus, for the first time, an object opposes the self in the form of something that exists outside and manifests only through a special action. Another incentive for the separation of the self from the general mass of sensations, that is, for the recognition of an external world, is provided by the frequent, multiple, and inevitable sensations of pain and discomfort, the elimination and avoidance of which are ordered by the pleasure principle. In exercising its own dominion, a tendency arises to separate from the self anything that may become a source of displeasure, to expel it, and to create a pure pleasure self that faces an alien and threatening external world. The boundaries of this primitive pleasure self cannot escape rectifications through experience. Some of the things one is ready to rid oneself of because they bring pleasure do not belong to the ego but to work, and some sufferings one seeks to expel turn out to be inseparable from the ego due to their internal origin. One comes to learn a process by which, through a free orientation of its sensory activities, and by appropriate muscular action, one can differentiate between what is internal, what belongs to the ego, and what is external, what emanates from the outside world. In this way, one takes the first step towards the introduction of the reality principle, which must dominate future development. This differentiation, of course, serves the practical purpose of allowing a person to defend themselves against the sensations of displeasure they actually feel or perceive as threatening. To defend against certain unpleasant excitations originating from within, the ego cannot use any other methods than those it uses against discomforts coming from the outside, and this is the starting point of significant pathological disturbances. Thus, the ego separates itself from the external world, or more precisely, originally, the ego encompasses everything, and then it separates an external world from itself. Our current sense of ego is therefore a minimal residue of a much more inclusive feeling. In fact, a feeling that encompasses everything between the ego and the world surrounding it. If we can assume that many people still harbor this primary sense of self to a greater or lesser degree in their mental life, this feeling will coexist in them alongside the more restricted and defined sense of self associated with maturity, as a sort of counterpart to the latter. In this case, the ideational contents corresponding to it would precisely be those of infinity and connection with the universe, the same ideas as those of my friend. We are justified in assuming that the persistence of something that was there originally coexists with what has since derived from it, undoubtedly, as there is nothing strange in such a phenomenon, whether in the mental realm or elsewhere. Now, in the animal kingdom, we maintain the view that more developed species emerge from more primitive ones. However, we observe that simple forms continue to exist. For example, the race of great lizards became extinct and was replaced by mammals, yet a true representative of that race, the crocodile, still lives among us. This analogy may seem too distant and is also weakened by the fact that the surviving lower species are not, for the most part, the true ancestors of the most developed current species. In general, the intermediate stages have disappeared, and we only know them through reconstructions. However, in the domain of the mind, what is primitive is so often preserved alongside its transformed version that there is no need to provide examples to prove its existence. When this happens, it is usually due to a divergence in development. A part, in quantitative terms, of an attitude or instinctive impulse remains unchanged, while another part has undergone a more advanced development. This brings us to the more general problem of conservation in the realm of the mind. The subject has scarcely been studied, but it is so attractive and important that it deserves our attention for some time, even if our justification is insufficient. Since we have overcome the error of assuming that forgetfulness, as we know it, means the destruction of the memory trace, that is, its annihilation, we tend to adopt the opposite view, that in mental life nothing once formed can perish, that everything is preserved in one way or another, and that under appropriate circumstances, such as when regression reaches far enough back, it can resurface. Let us try to understand what explains this hypothesis by using an analogy from another field. We will choose the history of the Eternal City as an example. Historians tell us that the oldest Rome was the Roma Quadrata, a fortified settlement on the Palatine Hill. Then followed the phase of the Septimontium, a federation of settlements on the various hills. After came the city delimited by the Servian Wall, and later, after all the transformations of the Republic and the early Caesars, the city that Emperor Aurelian surrounded with his walls. We will not follow the changes the city underwent, but we will ask what a visitor, who we assume has the most complete historical and topographical knowledge of these early stages, might find in present-day Rome. Apart from a few gaps, they will see the Aurelian Wall almost intact in some places. They might find sections of the Servian Wall where they have been excavated and exposed. If they know enough, perhaps more than current archaeology knows, they might trace the entire route of this wall and the outline of the Roma Quadrata on the city's map. They will find nothing of the buildings that occupied that ancient area, or perhaps rare remnants, for they no longer exist. The best information about Republican-era Rome would only allow them to pinpoint the locations of the temples and public buildings from that time. In their place, there are now ruins, but not of the buildings themselves, rather later restorations after fires or destruction. It is almost unnecessary to point out that all these remnants of ancient Rome are embedded in the fabric of a great metropolis that has grown in the last few centuries, since the Renaissance. Surely there is nothing ancient buried in the city's soil, or beneath its modern buildings. This is how the past is preserved in historical places like Rome. Now let us imagine, through a flight of imagination, that Rome is not a human place, but a psychic entity with just as long and rich a past, an entity where nothing that once existed would have disappeared, and where all previous phases of development still coexist alongside the most recent. This would mean that in Rome, the palaces of the Caesars and the Septizonium of Septimius Severus would still rise to their former height on the Palatine Hill, and that the Castel Sant'Angelo would still bear the beautiful statues that adorned it until the Gothic siege. But more than that, in the place where the Palazzo Caffarelli stands, the Temple of Jupiter Capitolinus would once again rise, without the palace needing to be removed, in its most recent form as seen by the Romans of the Empire, but also in its most primitive form when it still showed Etruscan shapes and was adorned with terracotta figures. Where the Colosseum stands now, we could simultaneously admire the long-lost Golden House of Nero. In the Piazza del Pantheon, we would find not only the present Pantheon, as bequeathed to us by Hadrian, but also, in the same place, the original building erected by Agrippa. In fact, the same ground would support both the Church of Santa Maria sopra Minerva and the ancient temple on which it was built. Thus, the observer would perhaps only need to change the direction of their gaze or their position to make one view or the other appear. It is clear that there is no sense in continuing to spin our fantasy, as it leads us to unimaginable and even absurd things. If we want to represent the historical sequence in spatial terms, we can only do so through a position in space, a single space that cannot contain two different contents. Our attempt seems a futile exercise, as it has only one justification. It shows us how far we are from mastering psychic life in pictorial terms. There is another objection to consider. One might ask why we specifically chose the past of a city to compare with the past of the mind. The hypothesis that all of the past is preserved is only valid in mental life if the organ of the mind has remained intact, and its tissues have not been damaged by trauma or inflammation. But in the history of a city, there are always destructive influences that could be compared to diseases of this kind. Even if it had a less tumultuous past than Rome and, like London, it scarcely suffered from enemy invasions, demolitions, and replacements of buildings occurred during the most peaceful development of a city. Therefore, a city is, a priori, unsuitable for such a comparison with a mental organism. We bow to this objection, and in abandoning our attempt to draw a striking contrast, we instead turn to what is, after all, a closer object of comparison, the body of an animal or a human being. But here too we find the same mosaic. Earlier phases of development are not preserved in any sense, but have been absorbed by subsequent phases for which they provided the material. The embryo is not discovered in the adult, just as the thymus gland of childhood is replaced after puberty by connective tissue, but is no longer present in itself. In the bones of the adult human marrow, I can certainly trace the outline of the child's bone, but it has disappeared, having lengthened and thickened to reach its final form. The idea that only the mind can allow such preservation of all earlier stages alongside the final form remains valid, and we are not able to represent this phenomenon in pictorial terms. Perhaps we are going too far with this. We must probably content ourselves with affirming that what has passed in mental life is preserved and is not necessarily destroyed. It is always possible that, even in the mind, something of the old may be erased or absorbed, whether in the normal course of things or exceptionally, to the point of being unable to be restored or revived by any means, or that conservation in general depends on certain favorable conditions. This is possible, but we do not know. We can only cling to the fact that it is more of a rule than an exception that the past is preserved in mental life. We are therefore perfectly willing to acknowledge that the oceanic feeling exists for many people, and we are inclined to link it to an early phase of the sense of self. The question that arises then is what right this feeling has to be considered the source of religious needs. It seems to me that the assertion is not convincing. After all, a feeling can only be a source of energy if it is itself the expression of a strong need. The derivation of religious needs from the child's distress and the resulting desire for the father seems undeniable, especially because this feeling does not simply continue from childhood, but is permanently maintained by the fear of the superior power of fate. I cannot think of any need in childhood as strong as the need for paternal protection. Thus, the role played by the oceanic feeling, which might seek something like the restoration of unlimited narcissism, is relegated to the background. The origin of the religious attitude can be traced in clear contours to the feeling of infantile distress. It is possible that there is something older behind this, but for now, it remains shrouded in darkness. I can imagine that later the oceanic feeling was linked to religion. The unity with the universe that constitutes its ideational content resembles a first attempt at religious consolation, as if it were another way of renouncing the danger that the ego recognizes as threatening from the outside world. Let me admit once again that it is very difficult for me to work with these almost intangible concepts. Another of my friends, whose insatiable thirst for knowledge led him to undertake the most unusual experiments and eventually gave him an encyclopedic knowledge, assured me that through the practice of yoga, by detaching from the world, focusing attention on bodily functions, and using particular breathing methods, it is possible to evoke new sensations and synesthesia within oneself, which he regards as regressions to primordial mental states long surpassed. He may see a physiological basis, so to speak, for much of the wisdom of mysticism. It would not be difficult to find connections here with a series of obscure modifications of mental life, such as trances and ecstasies, but I feel compelled to exclaim the words of Schiller's diver, "Let the one who breathes up here in the rosy light rejoice." The diver, the bliss. People want to be happy and stay that way. This effort has two aspects, a positive one and a negative one. On the one hand, it aims at the absence of pain and discomfort, and on the other, at experiencing strong sensations of pleasure. In the strictest sense, the word happiness refers only to the latter. According to this dichotomy of its objectives, human activity develops in two directions, depending on whether one seeks primarily or even exclusively to fulfill one or the other of these goals. As we can see, what determines the goal of life is simply the program of the pleasure principle, which has dominated the functioning of the mental apparatus from the start. There is no doubt about its effectiveness, yet its program is in conflict with everything, both with the macrocosm and the microcosm. There is no chance of it being realized, as all the laws of the universe are opposed to it. One is tempted to say that the intention for man to be happy is not included in the plan of creation. What we call happiness in the strictest sense, comes from the sudden satisfaction of needs that have been strongly repressed, and by nature, this is only possible as an episodic phenomenon. When any situation desired by the pleasure principle is prolonged, it only produces a slight feeling of satisfaction. We are made in such a way that we can obtain intense pleasure only through contrast, but very little through a state. Therefore, our possibilities of being happy are already limited by our constitution. However, unhappiness is much less difficult to experience. We are threatened with suffering from three directions: from our own body, which is doomed to decay and dissolution, and which cannot even do without pain and anxiety as warning signals; from the outside world, which can attack us with overwhelming and ruthless destructive forces; and finally, from our relations with other people. The suffering that comes from this last source is perhaps more painful for us than any other, and we tend to regard it as a kind of gratuitous addition, even though it cannot be less inevitable or fatal than suffering from other sources. It is not surprising that, under the pressure of these possibilities of suffering, people become accustomed to moderating their claims to happiness. This must be the case, for the pleasure principle itself, under the influence of the external world, has transformed into a more modest reality principle. A person considers themselves happy simply for having escaped unhappiness or for surviving their suffering. In general, the task of avoiding suffering relegates the task of obtaining pleasure to the background. Reflection teaches us that the fulfillment of this task can be attempted through very different paths. Moreover, all of these paths have been recommended by various worldly schools of wisdom and practiced by people. The unlimited satisfaction of all needs appears to be the most seductive method for leading life, but it means putting pleasure before caution, and thus, over time, it brings about its own punishment. The other methods, where avoiding discomfort is the main goal, are distinguished by the source of discomfort to which they primarily direct their attention. Some of these methods are extreme, while others are moderate. Some are unilateral, while others address the problem simultaneously from multiple points. Against the suffering that may arise from human relations, the best protection is voluntary isolation, staying away from other people. The happiness that can be attained through this path is, as we see, the happiness of tranquility. Similarly, against the feared external world, one can only defend oneself through some form of withdrawal from it, if one intends to solve the task alone, although there is indeed another preferable path. Becoming a member of the human community, and with the help of a technique guided by science, taking action against nature and submitting it to human will. Then one works with everyone for the good of all. But the most interesting methods for avoiding suffering are those that seek to influence our own organism. In the end, all suffering is just a sensation. It only exists to the extent that we feel it, and only because of certain forms of regulation within our organism. The simplest but also most effective among these methods of influence is the chemical method. Intoxication, although the mechanism is not entirely understood, is a fact. Foreign substances, when present in the blood or tissues, directly provide us with pleasant sensations and modify the conditions governing our sensitivity in such a way that we become unable to receive unpleasant impulses. These two effects do not only occur simultaneously, but they also seem to be closely linked to one another. However, there must be substances in the chemistry of our own bodies that have similar effects, because we know at least one pathological state, mania, where a condition of intoxication arises without the administration of intoxicating drugs. Moreover, our normal mental life presents oscillations between relatively easy release of pleasure and comparatively great difficulty, alongside which there is a diminished or increased receptivity to displeasure. It is very regrettable that this toxic side of mental processes has so far escaped scientific examination. The service rendered by intoxicating means in the struggle for happiness and to keep misery at bay is so appreciated that both individuals and entire nations have given them an established place in the economy of their libido. To these means, we owe not only the immediate relief of pleasure, but also a highly desired degree of dependence on the external world, because it is known that, with the help of this pacifier of concerns, one can withdraw at any time from the pressure of reality and find refuge in a world of one's own, with better conditions for sensitivity. As is well known, it is precisely this property of toxins that also determines their danger and harmfulness. They are responsible, under certain circumstances, for the unnecessary waste of a great deal of energy that could have been used to improve the human condition. The complicated structure of our mental apparatus, however, admits a whole series of influences. Just as the satisfaction of instincts makes us happy, it also causes us great suffering if the outside world leaves us to starve or refuses to satisfy our needs. Therefore, it can be hoped to free oneself from part of one's suffering by influencing instinctual impulses. This type of defense against suffering no longer acts on the sensory apparatus, but seeks to dominate the internal sources of our needs. The outward form of this is realized in regulating instincts, as prescribed by the worldly wisdom of the East and the practice of yoga. If this succeeds, the subject has certainly renounced all other activities and sacrificed their life. Moreover, they have once again achieved the happiness of tranquility. We follow the same path when our goals are less extreme and we simply attempt to control our instinctive life. In this case, the controlling elements are the higher psychic organisms that have been subjected to the reality principle. In this way, the goal of satisfaction is absolutely not abandoned, but a certain protection against suffering is ensured, as dissatisfaction is not felt with as much pain in the case of instincts kept in dependence as in the case of uninhibited instincts. In contrast, there is an inevitable reduction in the potential for pleasure. The feeling of happiness derived from the satisfaction of a wild instinctual impulse, untamed by the ego, is incomparably more intense than that derived from the satisfaction of an instinct that has been domesticated. Another technique for avoiding suffering is the use of libidinal displacement allowed by our mental apparatus, through which its function gains flexibility. The task here is to shift instinctual goals in such a way that they cannot confront the frustration of the outside world. Within this framework, the sublimation of instincts provides great assistance. One gains even more if one can sufficiently increase the pleasure yield from sources of psychic and intellectual work. When this is the case, fate can do little against oneself. A satisfaction of this type, such as the joy of an artist in creating, giving form to their fantasies, or that of a scientist in solving problems or discovering truths, has a special quality that we will likely be able to characterize one day in metapsychological terms. For now, we can only say figuratively that these satisfactions seem more refined and elevated, but their intensity is light in comparison with the saturation of raw and primary instinctual impulses, and they do not convulse our physical being. The weak point of this method is that it cannot be applied universally. It is only accessible to a few. It assumes the possession of special dispositions and talents, which are far from common in a practical sense, and even for those who possess them, this method cannot offer complete protection against suffering, nor create an impenetrable armor against the arrows of fate. Moreover, it often fails when the source of suffering is the person's own body. When there is no special disposition in a person that imperatively directs the course of their interests in life, ordinary professional work, open to all, can play the role prescribed by Voltaire's wise counsel. It is not possible, within the scope of a brief study, to adequately discuss the importance of work for the economy of libido. No other technique for conducting life ties the individual as firmly to reality as that of emphasizing work, because work gives them at least a secure place in a portion of reality. In the human community, the possibility of directing a large amount of libidinal components, whether aggressive or even erotic, to professional work and the relationships associated with it, gives it a completely secondary value as an indispensable element for preserving and justifying existence in society. Professional activity is a particular source of satisfaction if it is freely chosen. That is, if it enables the use of existing inclinations of persistent or constitutionally reinforced instinctual impulses through sublimation. Yet, as a path to happiness, work is highly appreciated by men. They do not invest in it as much as they do in other avenues for satisfaction. The vast majority of people only work under the pressure of need, and this natural human version of work presents the most difficult social problems. While this process clearly shows an intention to detach from the outside world by seeking validation in internal psychic processes, the next process manifests these characteristics more strongly. The connection to reality weakens even further, and satisfaction is obtained from illusions recognized as such. Without the discord between them, and reality interfering with pleasure. The area from which these illusions emerge is the life of the imagination. At the time when the sense of reality developed, this area was explicitly exempt from the demands of reality verification and was set aside to satisfy desires, primarily realizing these satisfactions through fantasy. The pleasure of works of art is one of the main means of this satisfaction, a pleasure that, through the artist's action, becomes accessible even to those who are not creative. People who are receptive to the influence of art cannot overestimate its value as a source of pleasure and comfort in life. However, the light narcotic induced in us by art can only provide a temporary retreat from the pressure of vital needs and is not strong enough to make us forget real misery. Another process acts with more energy and depth. It considers reality as the only enemy and as the source of all suffering which is impossible to live with, so it must break all connection with it if one wishes to be happy in a certain way. The hermit turns his back on the world and does not connect with it, but he is capable of doing more than that. He can try to recreate the world, to build in its place another world in which the most unbearable features are eliminated and replaced with others more in line with his desires. But one who desperately challenges and takes this path toward happiness generally achieves nothing, reality being too strong for him. He becomes a madman who, for the most part, finds no one to help him realize his illusion. However, it is asserted that each of us behaves in a certain aspect like a paranoid who corrects an aspect of the world he finds unbearable by reconstructing a desire and introducing this illusion into reality. An important case occurs when this attempt to provide certainty of happiness and protection from suffering through a delusional remodeling of reality is carried out by a considerable number of people collectively. The religions of humanity must be classified among the massive deceptions of this type. It goes without saying that no one sharing a deception recognizes it as such. I do not think I have made a complete enumeration of the methods by which people strive to achieve happiness and ward off suffering. I also know that the material could be organized differently. There is one procedure I have not yet mentioned, not because I forgot it, but because it is better to mention it later. And how could one forget it among all the others? This technique in the art of living is distinguished not only by a very remarkable combination of characteristics, but also, of course, by aiming to make the subject independent of fate, as it is preferred to call it, and to do so, it locates satisfaction in internal mental processes. In doing so, it uses the displacement of libido we have already discussed, but does not turn away from the outside world. On the contrary, it clings to objects belonging to this world and gains happiness from an emotional relationship with them. It does not simply avoid discomfort, an objective we might call tired resignation, but goes beyond that and clings to the original passionate struggle for a positive realization of happiness. And perhaps it brings the subject closer to this goal than any other method. I am, of course, referring to the way of life that makes love the center of everything, seeking all satisfaction in loving and being loved. Such a psychic attitude is quite natural for us all. One of the forms in which love manifests itself, sexual love, has given us the most intense experience of overwhelming pleasure and thus provided us with a model for our quest for happiness that is more natural than persisting in seeking happiness through the path where we first found it. The weak side of this life technique is easy to see. Otherwise, no human being would have thought of abandoning this path to happiness for another. We are never as vulnerable to suffering as when we love. We are never as powerless and unhappy as when we have lost our loved one or their love. But this does not negate the life technique based on the value of love as a means of achieving happiness. In reality, there is much more to say about this. From here, we can consider the interesting case where happiness in life is primarily sought in the pleasure of beauty, where it presents itself to our senses and judgment, whether in human forms and gestures, in objects and natural landscapes, or in artistic or even scientific creations. This aesthetic attitude toward the goal of life offers little protection against the threat of suffering, but can compensate for much. The pleasure of beauty has a particular and slightly intoxicating quality. Beauty has no obvious utility, and there is no clear cultural need for it. However, civilization could not do without it. The science of aesthetics studies the conditions under which things are perceived as beautiful, but it has been unable to provide an explanation of the nature and origin of beauty. As often happens, the lack of success is concealed under a torrent of resonant and empty words. Psychoanalysis, unfortunately, has little to say about beauty either. What seems certain is its derivation from the realm of sexual feeling. The love of beauty seems to be an inhibited desire toward its goal. Beauty and attraction were originally attributes of the sexual object. It is worth noting that the genital organs themselves, whose sight is always exciting, are almost never judged as beautiful. The quality of beauty, however, seems to be attributed to certain secondary sexual characteristics. Despite its incompleteness, I venture to make a few observations in conclusion of our investigation. The program of achieving happiness, imposed by the pleasure principle, cannot be fully realized. However, in reality, we must, and in fact cannot, give up our efforts to get closer to its accomplishment by one means or another. There are many different paths in this direction, and we can prioritize the positive aspect of the goal, the search for pleasure, or the negative aspect, that of discomfort. But none of these paths can lead us to what we desire. Happiness, in the restricted sense where we recognize it as possible, is a problem of the individual's libido economy. There is no golden rule applicable to everyone. Each person must discover for themselves in what concrete way and what types of factors will influence their choice. It is a matter of how much real satisfaction they can hope to obtain from the outside world, to what extent they feel driven to detach from it, and finally, how much strength they feel they must exert to modify the world and adapt it to their desires. In this domain, their psychic constitution will play a decisive role. Regardless of external circumstances, a primarily erotic man will prioritize his emotional relationships with others. A narcissistic person, inclined towards self-sufficiency, will seek most of his satisfaction in his internal mental processes. Meanwhile, an action-oriented person will never relinquish the outside world in which he can experience his strengths. As for the second type, the nature of his talents and the amount of instinctual sublimation available to him will determine where he locates his interests. Every choice, pushed to the extreme, will be penalized by exposing the individual to the dangers that arise if an exclusively chosen life technique proves to be unsuitable. Just as a prudent businessman avoids putting all his capital into one venture, ordinary wisdom may not advise us to seek all our satisfaction in one single aspiration. Its success is never guaranteed, as it depends on the convergence of many factors, perhaps most importantly, on the capacity of the psychic constitution to adapt its function to the environment, and then exploit this environment to yield pleasure. A person born with a particularly unfavorable instinctive constitution, who has not adequately experienced the transformation and reorganization of their libidinal components, essential for future accomplishments, will struggle to obtain happiness from their external situation, especially if confronted with tasks of some difficulty. As a last life technique, which will at least bring them substitute satisfactions, they are often led to flee toward neurotic illness, a flight they often embark on when they are still young. A person who observes that their own quest for happiness fails may find comfort in the pleasure of chronic intoxication, or embark on a desperate attempt at rebellion, visible in psychosis. Religion limits this game of choice and adaptation, as it imposes its own path on everyone to acquire happiness and protect against suffering. Its technique consists of devaluing life and distorting the image of the real world in a delusional way, which amounts to intimidating the intellect by forcefully fixing it in a state of psychic infantilism and leading it into mass deception. Religion manages to prevent many individuals from falling into personal neurosis, but little more. As we have said, there are many paths that can lead to achievable happiness for men, although none of them does so with certainty. Even religion cannot keep its promise if the believer is ultimately forced to speak of God's unfathomable decrees. He admits that what remains as the last possible comfort and source of pleasure in his suffering is unconditional submission. And if he is willing to do this, he could have avoided this detour. Chapter 3. Our search for happiness has so far only taught us what is part of common knowledge, and even if we go beyond that, the problem of why it is so difficult for men to be happy does not seem to offer a greater perspective than learning something new. We have already provided the answer by indicating the three sources of our suffering: the superior power of nature, the weakness of our own bodies, and the insufficiency of the norms that regulate the mutual relationships of human beings in the family, the state and society. Regarding the first two sources, our judgment can hardly hesitate. We are forced to recognize these sources of suffering and submit to the inevitable. We will never completely dominate nature, and our bodily organism, which is in turn part of that nature, will always remain a transient structure with a limited capacity for adaptation and realization. This recognition does not have a paralyzing effect. On the contrary, it indicates the direction of our activity. If we cannot eliminate all suffering, we can eliminate some and alleviate others. The experience of many thousands of years has convinced us of this. Regarding the third source, the social source of suffering, our attitude is different. We do not admit it at all. We do not see why the regulations we have established should not, on the contrary, be a protection and benefit for each of us. Yet when we consider the little success we have had, precisely in this area of preventing suffering, we are assailed by the suspicion that there might also be here an unconquerable piece of nature, this time a part of our own psychic constitution. When we begin to consider this possibility, we encounter such a surprising argument that we must pause to reflect on it. This argument suggests that what we call our civilization is largely responsible for our misery, and that we would be much happier if we gave it up and returned to primitive conditions. I call this argument surprising because, no matter how we challenge the concept of civilization, it is a certain fact that all the things we try to protect ourselves from the threats of suffering are part of this very civilization. How did so many people come to adopt this strange attitude of hostility toward civilization? I believe the foundation for this attitude was a deep and long-standing dissatisfaction with the state of existing civilization at the time, and that from this foundation, a condemnation was built due to certain concrete historical events. I think I know what the last and second to last of these events were. I am not learned enough to trace the chain of these events far back in the history of the human species, but one factor of this hostile stance toward civilization must have already been at play during the victory of Christianity over pagan religions, as it was strongly tied to the low regard the Christian doctrine had for earthly life. The second to last of these events occurred when the progress of exploratory voyages led to contact with primitive peoples and races. As a result of insufficient observation and a mistaken view of their customs and traditions, Europeans felt that these people led a simple, happy life with few needs, a life that was inaccessible to their visitors with their superior civilization. Later experience corrected some of these judgments. In many cases, observers had attributed the absence of complicated cultural demands to what was actually due to the generosity of nature and the ease with which basic human needs were satisfied. The most recent occasion is particularly familiar to us. It occurred when the mechanism of neurosis, threatening to undermine the minimal happiness enjoyed by civilized men, was discovered. It was found that a person became neurotic because they could not tolerate the amount of frustration society imposed on them in service of its cultural ideas, and it was concluded that the abolition or reduction of these demands would lead to a return to possibilities of happiness. There is also an additional factor of disappointment. In recent generations, humanity has made extraordinary progress in the natural sciences and their technical application, establishing control over nature in a way never before imagined. The individual steps of this progress are well known, and it is unnecessary to list them. People are proud of these achievements, and they have the right to be, but it seems they have observed that this newly acquired power over space and time, this subjugation of the forces of nature, which is the fulfillment of a desire thousands of years old, has not increased the amount of pleasant satisfaction they can hope for from life, and has not made them happier. Based on this fact, we should simply conclude that power over nature is not the only prerequisite for human happiness, just as it is not the sole goal of cultural effort. We should not deduce from this that technical progress is of no value to the economy of our happiness. One might ask, is there no positive gain in pleasure, no undeniable increase in my sense of happiness, if I can, as often as I wish, hear the voice of one of my children living hundreds of miles away, or if I can learn, at the earliest possible moment, that a friend has safely reached his destination after a long and difficult journey? Isn't it true that medicine has succeeded in significantly reducing infant mortality and the danger of infection for women in childbirth, and that, in fact, it has greatly extended the life expectancy of a civilized person? There is a long list that could be added to the benefits of this type, which are due to the now depreciated era of scientific and technical advancements. But here we hear the voice of the pessimistic critique, warning us that most of these satisfactions follow the pattern of cheap pleasure, glorified in anecdote, achieved by sticking a bare leg out from under the covers on a cold winter night, only to put it back under the covers. If the railroad had not conquered distances, my child would never have left his hometown, and I would not need a telephone to hear his voice. If ocean travel had not been introduced, my friend would not have undertaken a sea voyage, and I would not need a cable to ease my anxiety about him. What is the point of reducing infant mortality when it is precisely this reduction that imposes the greatest restriction on our ability to have children, so that in the end, we raise no more children than in the time before the age of hygiene, while having created difficult conditions for our sexual life within marriage, and likely working against the beneficial effects of natural selection? And finally, what is the point of a long life if it is difficult and devoid of joy, and if it is so filled with misery that we can only welcome death as a release? It seems certain that we do not feel at ease in our current civilization, but it is very difficult to form an opinion on whether people from earlier times were happier, and to what extent, and what role their cultural conditions played in the matter. We tend to view the anguish of others objectively, that is, to position ourselves with our own needs and sensitivities within their conditions, and then examine what opportunities we find in them to experience happiness or misfortune. This method of analysis, which seems objective because it ignores variations in subjective sensitivity, is, of course, the most limited, as it substitutes the mental states of others, however unknown, for our own. Happiness, however, is something essentially subjective, no matter how horrified we are by the situations of an ancient galley slave, a peasant during the 30 Years' War, a victim of the Inquisition, or a Jew waiting for a pogrom. It is impossible for us to feel within these people, to guess the changes that the original mental stupidity, a gradual process of numbness, the cessation of expectations, and the most brutal or refined methods of narcotization have produced in their receptivity to sensations of pleasure and displeasure. Moreover, in the case of the most extreme possibility of suffering, special mental protective mechanisms come into play. It seems to me that it is not profitable to pursue this aspect of the problem further. It is time to direct our attention to the nature of this civilization on which doubts have been expressed about its value as a means of happiness. We will not seek a formula to express this nature in a few words until we have learned something from examining it. We will therefore simply say once again that the word civilization describes the whole of the achievements and regulations that distinguish our life from that of our animal ancestors, and which serve two objectives: to protect men from nature and to adjust their mutual relations. To learn more, we will gather the various traits of civilization individually as they manifest in human communities. In doing so, we will not hesitate to be guided by linguistic usage, or what is also called linguistic following, convinced that this will allow us to do justice to the inner discernments that still challenge expression in abstract terms. The first step is easy. We recognize as cultural all activities and resources that are useful to humans in making the earth useful and protecting them from the violence of the forces of nature. Regarding this aspect of civilization, there can hardly be any doubts. If we look far enough back, we will find that the earliest acts of civilization were the use of tools, the control of fire, and the construction of dwellings. Among these, the control of fire stands out as quite an extraordinary and unparalleled achievement, while the others opened paths that humanity has followed ever since, and whose impulse is easy to guess. With each tool, man perfects his own organs, whether motor or sensory, or he eliminates the limits of their functioning. Motor skills make available gigantic forces that he can use in any direction. With boats and airplanes, neither water nor air can hinder his movements. With glasses, he corrects the defects of the lens in his own eye. With the telescope, he sees far away. With the microscope, he surpasses the limits of visibility imposed by the structure of his retina. With the camera, he created an instrument that captures fleeting visual impressions, just as a gramophone record captures equally fleeting auditory impressions. Both are essentially materializations of the memory power of his mind. With the help of the telephone, he can hear at distances once considered inaccessible, even in a fairy tale. Writing, in its origin, was the voice of the absent, and the living voice was a substitute for the maternal womb, the first dwelling that, most likely, man continues to desire, and in which he felt safe and at ease. The psychoanalytic material, although incomplete and not amenable to a clear interpretation, nevertheless admits a conjecture that seems fantastic about the origin of this human feat. It seems that primitive man, when in contact with fire, satisfied an infantile desire related to it by extinguishing it with a stream of his own urine. The legends we possess leave no doubt about the originally phallic viewpoint of the tongues of fire when they rise toward the sky, extinguishing the fire becoming a kind of sexual act with a man, a pleasure tied to sexual power in a homosexual competition. He who renounced this desire and avoided the fire could take it with him and submit it to his own use. By damping the fire of his own sexual excitement, he had tamed the natural force of fire. This great conquest was, therefore, the reward for his renunciation of instinct. Moreover, it seems that the woman was designated as the keeper of the fire, kept captive in the domestic hearth, because her anatomy prevented her from yielding to the temptation of this desire. It is also noteworthy that the regularity with which analytical experience attests to the connection between ambition, fire, and urethral eroticism is remarkable. These things that man has brought with his science and technique to this earth, not only as an organism of his species, but also as part of nature, are not merely the stuff of fairy tales. They are the true fulfillment of all the desires of fairy tales. All these goods can be claimed as cultural acquisitions. Long ago, an ideal conception of omnipotence and omnipresence was formed, which was embodied in its gods. To these gods were attributed all the things that their desires found inaccessible or forbidden. One can therefore say that these gods were cultural ideals. Today, man has reached a degree quite close to this ideal. He has almost become a god himself. However, it is true, as ideals are generally achieved according to the common judgment of humanity, that this is not completely, in some aspects not at all, and in others only halfway. Man has become, so to speak, a kind of proto-god. It is truly magnificent when he uses all his auxiliary organs, but these organs have not developed naturally and sometimes pose many problems. Nevertheless, he has the right to console himself with the thought that development will not stop precisely with the year 1930 AD. Future eras will bring new and probably unimaginable progress in this field of civilization and further increase man's resemblance to God. But in the interest of our research, we will not forget that the modern man does not feel happy in his role as God. We thus recognize that countries have reached a high level of civilization. If we observe that everything that can assist in the exploitation of the earth by man and his protection against the forces of nature, everything that is useful to him is taken care of and realized efficiently in these countries. Rivers threatening to flood the land are regulated in their flow, and their water is directed through canals to places where there is a shortage. The soil is carefully cultivated and planted with the appropriate vegetation. The mineral wealth of the subsoil is carefully extracted and transformed into materials and tools necessary, and communication means are vast and reliable. Moreover, wild and dangerous animals have been exterminated, and the breeding of domesticated animals thrives. But we demand something more from civilization than this, and it is remarkable that we also expect these achievements in these same countries, as if we wanted to deny the first demand we made. We also rejoice as a sign of civilization when people devote their care to what has no practical value, to what is useless. For example, if the necessary green spaces in a city, such as playgrounds and places for relaxation, are also adorned with statues, or if the windows of houses are decorated with flower pots, we quickly observe that this useless thing we hope civilization will value is beauty. We demand that civilized man revere beauty wherever he sees it in nature, and that he creates it in the objects of his work to the extent of his possibilities. However, this situation is far from meeting all our requirements for civilization. We also expect signs of cleanliness and order. We do not value the cultural level of an Englishman from Shakespeare's time when we read that there was a large dump in front of his father's house in Stratford. We are outraged and call it barbaric, which is the opposite of civilized. When we find country paths littered with paper, the dirt of all kinds seems incompatible with civilization. We also extend our demand for cleanliness to the human body. We are surprised by the unpleasant odor emanating from the Sun King, and shake our heads in Iceland when we are shown the small wash basin where Napoleon performed his morning toilette. In fact, the idea of establishing the use of soap as a true criterion of civilization does not surprise us. The same goes for order. Just as cleanliness applies only to man's works, order, on the other hand, has been imitated from nature. Man's observation of great astronomical regularities not only provided a model for introducing order into his life, but also gave him the first starting points for doing so. Order is a kind of constraint on repetition, whereby, once a regulation is firmly established, it determines when, where, and how something must be done, so that in every similar circumstance, hesitation and indecision are avoided. The benefits of order are undeniable. It allows men to use space and time in the best possible way while preserving their psychic forces. We would have the right to expect that order would have found its place in human activities from the beginning, and without difficulty. We may be surprised that this did not happen, and that, on the contrary, human beings show an innate tendency toward disorder, irregularity, and instability in their work, and that it is even necessary to undergo laborious training before they learn to follow the example of their celestial models. Beauty, cleanliness, and order clearly occupy a special place among the demands of civilization. No one will argue that they are as important for life as the control of the forces of nature or certain other factors we will discover. But no one cares to put them second, as if they were trivialities. Civilization is not concerned exclusively with what is useful, as demonstrated by the example of beauty, which we want to include among the interests of civilization. The utility of order is fairly obvious, while cleanliness also requires hygiene, and we may suspect that even before the era of scientific prophylaxis, the connection between the two was not entirely foreign to man. Still, utility does not fully account for these efforts. There must be something else at play. However, no trait seems to better characterize civilization than its esteem and encouragement of man's higher mental activities, his intellectual, scientific, and artistic achievements, and the primary role he assigns to ideas in human life. Among these ideas, religious systems stand out, whose complex structure I have tried to shed light on elsewhere. Next come philosophical speculations, and finally, what could be called human ideals, his ideals concerning the possible perfection of individuals, peoples, or humanity as a whole, and the demands he places based on these ideas. The fact that these creations are not independent of one another, but are, on the contrary, closely interconnected, increases the difficulty not only of describing them, but also of tracing their psychological derivation. Starting from the premise that, generally, the driving force behind all human activities is an effort to achieve the two converging goals of utility and pleasure, we must assume that this is also true for the manifestations of civilization we have discussed here, although this is easily visible only in scientific and aesthetic activities. But there is no doubt that the other activities also respond to strong needs in men, perhaps to needs that only develop in a minority. We must also not be deceived by value judgments related to a particular religion, philosophical system, or ideal, whether considered the highest accomplishments of the human mind or aberrations. We can only recognize that where they are present, and especially where they are dominant, a high level of civilization is implicit. The final characteristic of civilization remains to be evaluated, but it is undoubtedly not the least important: the way in which relations between men are regulated, their social relations. These relations touch a person as a neighbor, as a source of help, as a sexual object for another person, as a member of a family and a state. It is particularly difficult here to avoid particular idealistic demands and to see what is civilized. Perhaps we can begin by explaining that the element of civilization becomes important with the first attempt to regulate these social relations. If this attempt were not made, relations would be subject to the arbitrary will of the individual, meaning the physically stronger man would decide according to his own interests and instinctive impulses. Nothing would change if this stronger man were to meet someone even stronger than him. Social life is only possible when a majority, stronger than any individual, comes together and stays united against all separate individuals. The power of this community is then established as a right in opposition to the power of the individual, who is condemned as brute force. This situation of the power of the community against the power of the individual constitutes the decisive step of civilization. Its essence lies in the fact that the members of the community limit themselves in their possibilities for satisfaction, whereas the individual knew no such limitations. The first demand of civilization is therefore that of justice. This means that the security of a law, once established, will not be broken in favor of an individual. This implies nothing regarding the ethical value of that law. The subsequent course of cultural development seems to be tending toward a state of law where the law is no longer the expression of the will of a small community, caste, or racial group behaving like a violent individual against other groups of people, perhaps more numerous. The final result should be a state of law to which all, except those who are incapable of integrating into a community, have contributed by sacrificing their instincts and which once again leaves no one at the mercy of brute force. The freedom of the individual is not a gift of civilization. It was greater before the existence of civilization. Although at that time it had little real value because the individual was barely able to defend it, the development of civilization imposes restrictions on it, and justice requires that no one escapes these restrictions. What is felt in a human community as a desire for freedom may be a revolt against an existing injustice, and can therefore promote a greater development of civilization and remain compatible with it. But it can also stem from the remnants of one's original personality, which has not yet been tamed by civilization and may thus become the basis for hostility to civilization. The impulse for freedom is thus directed against particular forms and demands of civilization, or against civilization as a whole. It does not seem that any influence can change a man's nature to that of a termite. He will undoubtedly always defend his right to individual freedom against the will of the group. A large part of humanity's struggles focuses on the single task of finding a suitable accommodation that brings happiness between the individual's claims and the cultural claims of the group. One of the issues affecting humanity's fate is whether such accommodation can be achieved by a particular form of civilization, or if this conflict is irreconcilable. By allowing common sentiment to guide us in deciding which aspects of human life should be considered civilized, we have gained a clear impression of the overall landscape of civilization. While it is true that to this day we have discovered nothing that is universally known, we have taken care not to fall into the prejudice that civilization is synonymous with refinement or that it is the preordained path to perfection for mankind. But now, a perspective arises that may lead in a different direction. The development of civilization presents itself as a particular process that humanity experiences, and in which several things seem familiar to us. We can characterize this process in reference to the changes brought about by the familiar instinctive dispositions of human beings, the satisfaction of which is, after all, the economic task of our lives. Some of these instincts wear out in such a way that, in their place, something emerges which we describe in an individual as a character trait. The most notable example of this process is found in the anal erotism of young humans. Their original interest in excretory functions, their organs and products, transforms during their growth into a set of traits familiar to us, such as an obsession with order and cleanliness, qualities that, while valuable and appreciated in themselves, can intensify to the point of becoming strongly dominant, producing what is called anal character. We do not know how this happens, but there is no doubt about the correctness of this observation. We have seen that order and cleanliness are important requirements of civilization. While their vital necessity is not very obvious, their adequacy as a source of pleasure is not immediately clear either. At this point, we can only marvel at the similarity between the process of civilization and the libidinal development of the individual. Other instincts, in addition to anal erotism, are driven to shift the conditions of their satisfaction, directing them toward other paths. In most cases, this process coincides with the sublimation of instinctive aims with which we are familiar. But in some cases it may differ. The sublimation of instinct is a particularly conspicuous trait of cultural development. It is what allows higher psychic activities, scientific, artistic, or ideological, to play such an important role in civilized life. If one were to give in to an initial impression, one might say that sublimation is a vicissitude imposed on instincts entirely by civilization, but it would be wiser to reflect a bit further on this. Thirdly and finally, and this seems the most important of all, it is impossible to overlook how much civilization relies on an instinctual renunciation. To what extent does it presuppose precisely the non-satisfaction, through pressure, repression, or other means, of powerful instincts? This cultural frustration dominates the vast realm of social relations between human beings. As we already know, it is the source of hostility against which all civilizations must struggle. It will also impose severe demands on our work, and consequently, there will be much to explain in this part. It is not easy to understand how an instinct can be deprived of its satisfaction, nor is it without danger if the loss is not compensated economically. One can be sure that severe disorders will occur. But if we wish to know what value can be attributed to our opinion that the development of civilization is a particular process comparable to the normal maturation of the individual, we must address another issue. We must ask ourselves what influences determined the origin of the development of civilization. How did it emerge, and why was its course determined? The task seems immense, and it is natural to be cautious. But I present below the conjectures I have been able to formulate after the primitive man discovered that he was literally in his own hands to improve his chances by working the land. He could not be indifferent to knowing whether another man was working against him or alongside him. The other man acquired value for him as a work companion with whom it was useful to coexist. Even earlier, in his simian prehistory, man had gotten into the habit of forming families, and the members of his family were probably his first helpers. It can be assumed that the foundation of families was linked to the moment when the need for genital satisfaction no longer manifested itself as a visitor who arrives suddenly and disappears for a long time, but settled in as a permanent tenant. When this occurred, the male acquired a motive for keeping the female, or speaking more generally, his sexual objects close to him, while the female, who did not want to be separated from her vulnerable young, was compelled, in their interest, to stay with the strongest male. In this primitive family was lacking an essential trait of civilization, the arbitrary will of its leader. The father was unrestricted in totem and taboo, 1912 to 1913. I've tried to show how the path led from this family to the next stage of communal life in the form of bands of brothers. By dominating their father, the children discovered that a combination could be stronger than a single individual. Totemic culture is based on the restrictions that the children had to impose on one another to maintain this new state of affairs. The observation of taboos was the first right or law. Thus, human communal life had a dual foundation: the constraint of labor created by external need, and the forces of love that made man not want to be deprived of his sexual object, the woman, and the woman did not want to be deprived of the part of herself that had been separated from her, her child. Eros and Ananke, love and necessity, also became the fathers of human civilization. The first result of civilization was that a significant number of people could now live together in community. Given that these two great powers cooperated, it made sense to expect that the further development of civilization would proceed smoothly toward even greater control over the external world and a greater extension of the number of people included in the community. It is not easy to understand how civilization could affect its participants other than by making them happy. The organic periodicity of the sexual process has persisted, it is true, but its effect on psychic sexual excitement has reversed. This change seems to be linked to the decrease in olfactory stimuli by which the menstrual process affected the male psyche. Its role has been taken over by visual excitations, which, in contrast to intermittent olfactory stimuli, were able to maintain a permanent effect. The taboo surrounding menstruation stems from this organic repression as a defense against an outdated phase of development. All other motives are likely secondary. This process repeats itself at another level when the gods of a past civilization period transform into demons. The reduction in olfactory stimuli seems to itself be a consequence of man's elevation from the ground through the adoption of an upright posture. This made his previously hidden genitals visible and in need of protection, thus causing feelings of shame. The fateful process of civilization would therefore have begun with man's adoption of an upright posture. From that moment, the chain of events would have progressed through the devaluation of olfactory stimuli and the isolation of the menstrual period, until visual stimuli became paramount, the genitals became visible, and from there to the continuation of sexual excitement, the foundation of the family, and thus up to the threshold of human civilization. This is only theoretical speculation, but it is important enough to deserve careful verification regarding the living conditions observed in animals closely related to humans. A social factor is also unquestionably present in the cultural tendency toward cleanliness, which has received a justification presented in hygienic considerations, but which manifested before its discovery. The urge toward cleanliness even comes from a desire to rid oneself of excrement that has become unpleasant to sensory perceptions. We know that in infancy things are different. Excrement does not evoke any repulsion in children. They see it as precious because it is part of their own body and has detached itself from them. Here, education insists with particular energy on accelerating the course of future development, ensuring that excrement no longer has value, but becomes repulsive, abominable, and loathsome. Such an inversion of values would hardly be possible if the substances expelled from the body were not condemned by their strong odors to share the hostility that reached olfactory stimuli after man adopted the upright posture. Thus, anal erotism first succumbs to the organic repression that paved the way for civilization. The existence of the social factor responsible for the later transformation of anal erotism is attested to by the fact that despite all human progress, the human being is hardly repulsed by the smell of their own excrement, but only by that of foreign excrement. Therefore, a person who is not clean, who does not hide their excrement, offends others. They show no consideration for others, and this is confirmed by our strongest and most common abusive terms. It would also be incomprehensible for man to use the name of his most faithful friend in the animal world, the dog, as a term of abuse if this creature had not earned his contempt for two characteristics. It is an animal whose dominant sense is smell, and which has no horror of excrement, and is not ashamed of its sexual functions. Before examining where an interference might arise, this knowledge of love as one of the foundations of civilization can serve as a pretext for a digression that will allow us to fill a gap left in a previous discussion. We mentioned that the discovery by man that genital sexual love offered him the most intense experiences of satisfaction, and in fact provided him with the prototype for all happiness, must have suggested to him that he should continue seeking the satisfaction of happiness in his life through sexual relationships and make genital erotism the center of his life. We went on to say that in doing so he became very dangerously dependent on a part of the external world, namely his chosen love object, and exposed himself to extreme suffering if he were rejected by this object, or lost it through infidelity or death. For this reason, sages of all eras have warned against this way of life with the greatest insistence, but despite this, it has not lost its appeal for a great number of people. A small minority is capable, due to its constitution, of finding happiness despite everything through the path of love. But for this to occur, significant mental changes in the function of love are necessary. These people free themselves from dependence on their object by shifting what they primarily value from the loved being to the act of loving. They protect themselves against the loss of the object by directing their love not toward unique objects but toward all men equally, and avoid the uncertainties and disappointments of genital love by distancing themselves from their sexual goals and transforming the instinct into a drive with a suppressed aim, which they produce within themselves. Thus they experience a state of uniformly suspended affective feeling, stable, which already bears little external resemblance to the tumultuous agitations of genital love, from which it is, however, probably derived. St. Francis is the one who went furthest in exploiting love in this way for the benefit of an inner sense of happiness. On the other hand, what we have recognized as one of the techniques for realizing the pleasure principle has often been associated with religion. This connection can exist in remote regions where the distinction between the self and objects, or between objects themselves, is neglected, according to an ethical point of view whose deepest motivation seems clear to us at this point. This disposition to universal love for humanity and the world represents the highest point that man can reach. From this first phase of the discussion, I would like to express my two main objections to this point of view. Love that does not discriminate seems to lose part of its own value by committing an injustice to its object, and secondly, not all men are worthy of love. The love that founded the family continues to operate in civilization, both in its original form, which does not renounce direct sexual satisfaction, and in its modified form of affection inhibited by aim. In each of these forms, it fulfills its function of uniting a considerable number of people more intensely than what can be achieved by the interest of common labor. The neglected way in which language uses the word love has a genetic justification. People call love the relationship between a man and a woman whose genital needs have led them to start a family, but they also use the term love to refer to the positive feelings between parents and children, and between siblings within a family. Although we are compelled to describe it as love with inhibited aim or affection, love with inhibited aim was originally a fully sensual love, and remains so in the unconscious of man. Fully sensual love and love with inhibited aim extend beyond the family and create new bonds with people previously strangers. Genital love leads to the formation of new families, while love inhibited by aim leads to friendships that become culturally valuable because they escape some of the limitations of genital love, such as its exclusivity. However, over time, the relationship between love and civilization loses its clarity. On one hand, love opposes the interests of civilization, and on the other hand, civilization threatens love with substantial restrictions. This rupture between the two seems inevitable. The reason is immediately recognizable, as it first manifests as a conflict between the family and the larger community to which the individual belongs. We have already perceived that one of civilization's main efforts is to unite people into large units, but the family will not relinquish the individual. The more united the members of a family are, the more they tend to withdraw from others, making it harder for them to enter the larger circle of life. The common lifestyle, which is phylogenetically the oldest and the only one that exists in childhood, will not be destroyed or disappear by the later acquired cultural lifestyle. Detaching oneself from the family becomes a task that every young person faces, and sometimes society helps to resolve this task through puberty and initiation rites. We feel that these are inherent difficulties in any psychic development and ultimately in any organic development. Moreover, women quickly oppose civilization and show its delaying and restrictive influence. These same women, who laid the foundations of civilization with the demands of their love, represent the interests of the family and sexual life. On the other hand, the work of civilization has increasingly become the domain of men, confronting them with ever more difficult tasks and forcing them to perform instinctual sublimations that women are less capable of. Since man does not have unlimited amounts of psychic energy, he must accomplish his tasks by wisely distributing his libido. What he uses for cultural purposes, he largely withdraws from women and sexual life. His constant association with men and his dependence on his relationships with them even distance him from his duties as a husband and father. In this way, the woman is forced to take a secondary role due to the demands of civilization and adopts a hostile attitude toward it. Civilization's tendency to restrict sexual life is no less clear than its other tendency to expand cultural unity. Its first totemic phase already includes the prohibition of the incestuous choice of the object, and this may be the most drastic mutilation the erotic life of man has ever known. Taboos, laws, and customs impose other restrictions that affect both man and woman equally. Not all civilizations go as far in this domain. Furthermore, the economic structure of society also influences the amount of sexual freedom that remains. As we know, civilization obeys the laws of economic necessity, for much of the psychic energy it uses for its own purposes must be withdrawn from sexuality. In this sense, civilization behaves with sexuality like a people or a group of its population that has subjugated another to its exploitation. The fear of a revolt from the repressed elements pushes civilization to adopt stricter precautionary measures. In our Western European civilization, a peak has been reached in this type of development. A cultural community is perfectly justified from a psychological perspective to begin prescribing the manifestations of sexual life in children, for there would be no prospect of curbing adult sexual lust if the groundwork had not been laid in childhood. But such a community can in no way justify denying such easily demonstrable and indeed remarkable phenomena concerning the sexually mature individual. The choice of an object is restricted to the opposite sex, and most extragenital satisfactions are forbidden as perversions. The demand demonstrated in these prohibitions to have a single type of sexual life for all does not take into account the innate or acquired differences in the sexual constitution of human beings, and thus prevents a good number of them from enjoying their sexuality, thus becoming a source of serious injustices. The result of such restrictive measures could be that, in normal people, those not hindered by their constitution, the entirety of their sexual interests flows smoothly into the open channels. However, heterosexual genital love, which is free from prescription, is in turn limited by other restrictions in the form of an insistence on legitimacy and monogamy. The current civilization clearly implies that it will only allow sexual relations based on a unique and indissoluble bond between a man and a woman. Furthermore, it does not appreciate sexuality as a source of pleasure in itself, and is only willing to tolerate it because, until now, there has been no substitute for this function in the propagation of the human race. This is, of course, an external image. Everyone knows that it has been impossible to put this into practice, even during relatively short periods. Only the weakest individuals have submitted to such an invasion of their sexual freedom, while individuals of a stronger nature have done so only under a compensatory condition, which will be mentioned later. Civilized society has been forced to turn a blind eye to many transgressions it should have punished according to its own norms. However, we must not ignore the fact that, despite failing to achieve all of its goals, this attitude of society is far from harmless. The sexual life of civilized man, although greatly deteriorated, sometimes gives the impression of involuting, just as our teeth and hair seem to do as functional organs. It is probably justified to assume that its importance as a source of feelings of happiness and in the fulfillment of our life goal has diminished significantly. Sometimes it seems to be perceived that it is not only the pressure of civilization, but something in the very nature of the function that deprives us of complete satisfaction and pushes us toward other paths. This may be wrong, it is hard to say. The opinion expressed previously rests on the following considerations. Man is an animal organism like others, with a clearly bisexual disposition. The individual corresponds to a function of two symmetrical halves, of which, according to some researchers, one is purely masculine and the other feminine. It is also possible that each half was originally hermaphroditic. Sex is a biological fact that, although it holds extraordinary importance in mental life, is difficult to grasp psychologically. We are accustomed to saying that every human being exhibits both masculine and feminine instinctual impulses, needs and attributes, but while anatomy may indicate characteristics of masculinity and femininity, psychology cannot. For psychology, the contrast between the sexes transforms into a contrast between activity and passivity, where we too easily identify activity with masculinity and passivity with femininity, a view that is not universally confirmed in the animal kingdom. The theory of bisexuality is still surrounded by many obscurities, and it is hard not to see as a serious obstacle in psychoanalysis the fact that it has yet to establish a connection with the theory of instincts. In any case, if we accept as a fact that each individual seeks to satisfy both masculine and feminine desires in their sexual life, we are prepared to consider the possibility that these two sets of demands may not be satisfied by the same object, and that they interfere with each other unless they can be kept separate, with each impulse directed toward a particular channel suited to it. Another difficulty arises from the fact that the erotic relationship is so often associated, beyond its own sadistic components, with a simple propensity toward aggression. The object of love will not always perceive these complications with the same degree of understanding and tolerance as the peasant woman who complained that her husband no longer loved her simply because he had not struck her for a week. However, the deepest conjecture is one that arises from what I mentioned earlier in my note at the bottom of page 46. By adopting an upright posture and depreciating its sense of smell, it is not only his anal eroticism that has threatened to fall victim to organic repression, but his entire sexuality, so that since then, the sexual function has been accompanied by a repugnance that can no longer be explained, and that prevents its complete satisfaction, thus pushing one away from their sexual goal towards sublimations and libidinal displacements. I know that Brewer, 1913, once noted the existence of a strong primary attitude of repugnance in sexual life. All neurotics and many others oppose the idea that we are born between urine and excrement. The genital organs also provoke strong olfactory sensations that many people cannot tolerate, and this disrupts their sexual relationships. Thus, we should conclude that the deepest root of sexual repression, which progresses with civilization, is the organic defense of the new form of life attained with the erection of man in relation to his previous animal existence. This result of scientific research coincides remarkably with the common prejudices that have often been expressed. However, these elements are, for the moment, only unconfirmed possibilities that have not been corroborated by science. It should not be forgotten either that, despite the undeniable importance of olfactory stimuli, there are even in Europe peoples for whom the strong genital odors that repulse us are highly appreciated as sexual stimulants, and they refuse to give them up. Chapter 5. Psychoanalytic work has shown us that it is precisely these life frustrations that cannot be tolerated by those called neurotic. The neurotic creates substitute satisfactions for himself in his symptoms, and these cause him suffering in themselves or become sources of suffering for him by creating difficulties in his relationships with his environment and the society to which he belongs. The latter fact is easy to understand. The former poses a new problem for us. But civilization demands other sacrifices in addition to the one represented by sexual satisfaction. We have approached the difficulty of cultural development as a general difficulty of development, attributing it to the inertia of the libido, its reluctance to abandon an old position for a new one. We essentially say the same thing when we derive the antithesis between civilization and sexuality from the circumstance that sexual love is a relationship between two individuals in which a third party can only be superfluous or disturbing, while civilization depends on relationships between a large number of individuals. When a love relationship is at its peak, there is no longer space for any interest in the environment. A couple of lovers is enough unto itself and does not even need the child they have in common to be happy. In no other case does the hero so clearly betray the core of his being, his goal of making one out of two. But when he has proverbially achieved it through the love of two human beings, he refuses to go further. Until now, we can easily imagine a cultural community formed by double individuals who, libidinally satisfied between themselves, are connected by bonds of work and common interests. If this were the case, civilization would not need to withdraw energy from sexuality. But this desirable state of affairs does not exist and never has. Reality shows us that civilization is not satisfied with the bonds we have allowed it so far. It seeks to unite the members of the community also libidinally and uses all means to do so. It fosters all paths through which strong identifications can be created between the members of the community and summons the libido inhibited by goals on the largest possible scale to reinforce the community bond through relationships of friendship. For these goals to be achieved, a restriction of sexual life is inevitable, but we cannot understand what the necessity is that drives civilization to follow this path and causes its antagonism with sexuality. There must be a disruptive factor that we have not yet discovered. The clue may be provided by one of the ideal requirements, as we called it, of civilized society, which is as follows: love thy neighbor as thyself. This is known worldwide and is undoubtedly one of the oldest phrases in Christianity, which presents it as its proudest claim. However, it is certainly not very old. Even in historical times it was still strange to humanity. Let us adopt a naive attitude toward it, as if we were hearing it for the first time. Could we then repress a feeling of surprise and perplexity? Why should we do so? What would it serve us? But above all, how to achieve it? How is it possible that my love, which is something precious to me, something I should not reject without thought, imposes duties on me for which I must be ready to make sacrifices? If I love someone, they must deserve it. I set aside the utility they may have for me, as well as their possible significance to me as a sexual object, because neither of these types of relationships are questioned when it comes to the precept of loving one's neighbor. They deserve it, if they are sufficiently similar to me in important ways, so that I can love myself in them. And they deserve it, if they are much more perfect than I am, so that I can love my ideal self in them. Again, I must love them if they are the child of my friend, because the pain my friend would feel if something happened to them would also be my pain, and I should therefore share it. But if they are a stranger to me and they cannot attract me either by their intrinsic value or by the importance they could have for my emotional life, it will be very difficult for me to love them. In fact, I would be wrong to do so, since my love is valued by all my people as a sign that I prefer them, and it is unfair to them to place a stranger on the same level as them. But if I must love them with this universal love simply because they too are an inhabitant of this earth, like an insect, a worm or a snake, then I fear that only a small portion of my love will be allocated to them, and not as much as, according to my reason, I have the right to reserve for myself. What sense does a precept, stated with such solemnity, make, if its fulfillment cannot be recommended as reasonable? Upon closer examination, I encounter even more difficulties. Not only is this stranger generally unworthy of my love, but I must also honestly confess that they are more deserving of my hostility or hatred. They seem to show no sign of love for me and show me no consideration. If they find an interest in me, they do not hesitate to harm me and do not wonder if the benefit they gain is proportional to the harm they cause me. In fact, they do not even need to gain an advantage. If they can satisfy some desire, they do not care about ridiculing me, insulting me, slandering me, or showing their superior power. The more confident they feel, and the more vulnerable I am, the more I can expect them to behave this way toward me. On the other hand, if they behave otherwise, showing me consideration and tolerance as a stranger, I'm prepared to treat them the same way in all cases, regardless of any precept. In fact, if this great commandment said, "Love your neighbor as your neighbor loves you," I would have no objection. There is a second commandment that seems even more incomprehensible to me, and that evokes an even stronger opposition in me. It is to love your enemies. However, upon further reflection, I see that I am wrong in considering it a greater opposition, because, in essence, it is the same. I now seem to hear a worthy voice warning me precisely that, because your neighbor is unworthy of love and is, on the contrary, your enemy, you must love them as yourself. I understand then that this is a case similar to the quia absurdum credo. It is highly probable that my neighbor, when ordered to love me as themselves, will react exactly as I did and will reject me for the same reasons. I hope they will not have the same objective reasons for doing so, but they will have the same idea as I do. Nevertheless, the behavior of human beings shows differences that ethics, without considering these innate or acquired differences, classifies as good or bad. As long as these inevitable differences are not eliminated, obedience to high ethical demands carries a prejudice for the goals of civilization, because it prioritizes the human being. One irresistibly recalls an incident in the French Chamber of Deputies during the debate on the death penalty. A member had passionately supported its abolition, and his speech was met with a tumultuous ovation, when a voice in the hall cried that it is the murderers who should take the first step. There is an element of truth behind all this, which people are so quick to deny. Men are not gentle creatures who wish to be loved, and who can only defend themselves at best if they are attacked. They are, on the contrary, creatures in whom a powerful dose of aggressiveness must be counted among their instinctive qualities. Therefore, their neighbor is for them not only an auxiliary or an object, but also someone on whom they are tempted to satisfy their aggression, to explore their capacity for work without understanding, to use sexually, to appropriate their belongings, to humiliate them, to inflict pain, to torture, and to kill them. Lupus, man is a wolf to man, who, in light of all their experience of life and history, would dare to contradict this statement? In general, this cruel aggressiveness waits for a provocation or serves another purpose, the goal of which could also have been achieved by gentler means under favorable circumstances when the counterforces that normally inhibit it are out of action. It then manifests itself spontaneously and reveals man as a wild beast for whom consideration for his own species is foreign. Anyone who recalls the atrocities committed during racial migrations, the invasions of the Huns, those of the peoples known as Mongols under Genghis Khan, the taking of Jerusalem by the pious Crusaders, or even the horrors of the recent Second World War, must humbly bow before this point of view. The existence of this inclination toward aggression, which we can detect in ourselves and which we justly assume to be present in others, is the factor that disrupts our relationships with others and forces civilization to incur a high energy cost. As a result of this primary hostility between human beings, civilized society is constantly threatened with disintegration. The interest in common work would not be enough to keep it united, as instinctive passions are stronger than reasonable interests. Civilization must use all its efforts to limit human aggressive instincts and contain the manifestations of these instincts through psychic reaction formations. Hence the use of methods to encourage men to identify with one another and establish relationships of love, even for forbidden purposes. Hence the restriction of sexual life and the commandment to love your neighbor as yourself, which is truly justified by the fact that no other thing goes as strongly against the original nature of man. Despite all efforts, these attempts by civilization have so far not resulted in anything very significant. While it hopes to avoid the worst excesses of brutal violence by reserving the right to use it against criminals, the law is unable to control the most careful and refined manifestations of human aggression. The time comes when each of us must give up the illusions we placed in our fellow men in our youth and learn how much difficulty and pain has been added to our lives by bad will. At the same time, it would be unjust to blame civilization for trying to eliminate struggle and competition in human activity. These things are undoubtedly necessary, but opposition is not necessarily enmity. It is simply misused and becomes an occasion for enmity. Communists believe they have found the way to free themselves from our ills. According to them, man is completely good and entirely disposed toward his neighbor, but the intuition of private property has corrupted his nature. The ownership of private wealth gives the individual power, and with it, the temptation to mistreat others, while the man excluded from possession is forced to revolt with hostility against his oppressor. If private property were abolished and all wealth were held in common, allowing everyone to benefit, bad will and hostility would disappear between men because everyone's needs would be met, and no one would have a reason to view another as their enemy. Therefore, all would willingly undertake the necessary work. I am not concerned with the economic criticisms of the communist system. I cannot assess whether the abolition of private property is timely or advantageous, but I can recognize that the psychological premises upon which the system rests are an unsustainable illusion. By abolishing private property, we deprive human love of one of its instruments of aggression, certainly a strong one, but not the strongest. Yet we have not altered the differences in power and influence that aggression exploits, nor have we changed anything about human nature. Aggression was not created by property. It reigned almost without limits in primitive times when property was still rare. It already manifests in the cradle, almost before property has abandoned its primitive anal form, and forms the basis of all affection and love between people, except perhaps for the relationship between mother and child. If we eliminate personal rights over material wealth, there remains the prerogative in the realm of sexual relationships, which is destined to become the source of the most intense aversion and violent hostility between men who are otherwise equal in other aspects. If we also eliminate this factor, allowing total freedom in sexual life and thus abolishing the family, the germ cell of civilization, it is difficult to easily predict the new directions civilization might take. However, one thing is certain: we can expect this indestructible trait of human nature to persist. Anyone who has known the miseries of poverty in their youth and has felt the indifference and arrogance of the wealthy should be immune to suspicion of lacking understanding or goodwill toward efforts to combat inequality of wealth among men and all that this implies. Undoubtedly, if one attempts to base this struggle on an abstract demand for justice and equality for all men, there is a very obvious objection to be made. Nature, by endowing individuals with extremely unequal physical characteristics and mental abilities, has introduced injustices for which there is no remedy. It is clear that it is not easy for men to renounce the satisfaction of this inclination toward aggression because they do not feel at ease without it. One must not underestimate the advantage a relatively small cultural group has in channeling this instinct in the form of hostility toward intruders. It is always possible to gather a considerable number of people in love, as long as there are others to receive the manifestations of their aggression. I have discussed the phenomenon whereby precisely those communities with contiguous territories, also related in other ways, engage in constant enmities and mutual mockery, like the Spanish and the Portuguese, for example, or the northern and southern Germans, the English and the Scots, etc. I have named this phenomenon the narcissism of small inheritances, although this doesn't help much in explaining it. We can now see that it is a convenient and relatively harmless satisfaction, of the inclination toward aggression, by which cohesion among community members is facilitated. In this sense, the dispersed Jewish people have rendered very useful services to the civilizations of the countries that have hosted them. However, unfortunately, all the massacres of Jews in the Middle Ages did not suffice to make this period more peaceful and safer for their Christian counterparts. When the Apostle Paul proposed universal love among men as the foundation of his Christian community, the inevitable consequence was the extreme intolerance of Christianity toward those who were excluded from it. For the Romans, who had not based their communal life as a state on love, religious intolerance was something foreign. Although for them religion was a concern of the state, and that state was impregnated with religion, it is not surprising that the dream of Germanic world domination required anti-Semitism as a complement. Moreover, it is intangible that the attempt to establish a new communist civilization in Russia found its psychological support in the persecution of the bourgeois. One can only wonder with concern what the Soviets will do after they have eliminated the bourgeois. If civilization imposes such significant sacrifices, not only on human sexuality, but also on human aggression, we can better understand why it is difficult to be happy in this civilization. Indeed, primitive man was in a better situation by not knowing the restrictions of instinct. On the other hand, his prospects for enjoying this happiness for long were very limited. The civilized man exchanged part of his happiness potential for part of his security. We must not forget that in the primitive family, only the chief benefited from this instinctive freedom, while the rest lived in servile suppression. In this primitive time of civilization, the contrast between a minority who enjoyed the benefits of civilization and a majority from whom these benefits were withheld was therefore pushed to the extreme. As for the primitive peoples who exist today, thorough research has shown that their instinctive life is not at all enviable because of its freedom, as it is subject to various restrictions, but perhaps more severe than those applied to modern civilized man. When we find precisely flaws in the current state of our civilization, we seek to uncover the roots of its imperfection. We undeniably exercise a legitimate right and do not show ourselves as enemies of civilization. We can hope that gradual changes will be made to our civilization to better satisfy our needs and escape our criticisms. But perhaps we should also familiarize ourselves with the idea that there are difficulties related to the nature of civilization that will yield to no effort of reform. Beyond the tasks of restricting instincts for which we are prepared, there lies the danger of a state of affairs that could be called the psychological poverty of groups. This danger is more threatening where the bonds of a society are constituted primarily by the identification of its members with one another, while the leading individuals of this type do not assume the importance that should be theirs in forming a group. The current state of America would give us a good opportunity to study the dangers civilization might face, but I will avoid the temptation of criticizing American civilization. I do not want to give the impression of wishing to use American methods myself. In none of my previous writings have I felt as strongly as I do now that what I describe is common knowledge, and that I am using paper, ink, and, at their appropriate moments, the work and materials of the composer and the printer to expose things that are obvious. For this reason, I would gladly pass the word if it seemed that the recognition of a special and independent aggressive instinct would mean an alteration of the psychoanalytic theory of instincts. However, we will see that this is not the case. It is simply a matter of highlighting an evolution of thought that has long been reached and following its consequences. Among all the parts of analytic theory that have developed slowly, the theory of instincts is the one that has had the most difficulty in making its way. Yet this theory was so indispensable to the entire structure that it had to be replaced. In what was initially my total bewilderment, I took as a starting point a phrase from the poet-philosopher Schiller, according to which hunger and love are what move the world. Hunger might represent the instincts aimed at the preservation of the individual, while love struggles for objects, and its main function, favored by nature, is the preservation of the species. Thus, to begin with, the instincts of the self clashed with the instincts of the object. It was to designate the energy of these latter instincts, and only these, that I introduced the term libido. Thus, the antithesis was between the instincts of the self and the libidinal instincts of love in its broadest sense, those directed toward an object. One of these object instincts, the sadistic instinct, was distinguished from the others because its goal was very far from love. Moreover, it was evident that it was, in certain respects, related to the instincts of the self and could not hide its close affinity with the instincts of domination, which have no libidinal aim. But these divergences were overcome. After all, sadism was clearly part of sexual life, where affection could be replaced by cruelty. Neurosis was considered the result of a conflict between the interest in self-preservation and the demands of the libido, a conflict in which the self emerged victorious, but at the cost of serious suffering and renunciations. Every analyst will admit that even today this view does not seem to be a long-dismissed error. However, changes had become indispensable as our research progressed, moving from the repression of object instincts to that of the self. The decisive step was the introduction of the concept of narcissism, that is, the discovery that the self itself is the original reservoir of the libido and continues to be so to some extent. This narcissistic libido turns toward objects and thus becomes object libido and can return to narcissistic libido. The concept of narcissism allowed for an analytical understanding of traumatic neuroses and many effects on the threshold of psychosis as well as of the latter. It was not necessary to abandon our interpretation of transference neuroses as the self's attempt to defend itself against sexuality, but the concept of libido was in danger, since the instincts of the self were also libidinal. It seemed inevitable that we should align libido with instinctual energy in general, as CJJ had already argued before. However, there remained within me a sort of conviction for which I was not yet able to find reasons, namely that instincts could not all be of the same type. The next step was taken in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, 1920, when the compulsion to repeat and the conservative nature of instinctual life first attracted my attention. Starting from speculations on the beginning of life and biological parallels, I concluded that in addition to the instinct for the preservation of living substance and its union into increasingly larger units, there must be another opposite instinct, dedicated to the dissolution of these units and their return to their primitive inorganic state. That is, in addition to eros, there existed an instinct of death. The phenomena of life could be explained by the concomitant or mutually antagonistic action of these two instincts. However, it was not easy to demonstrate the activities of this supposed death instinct. The manifestations of eros were striking and loud. It could be assumed that the death instinct operated silently within the organism for its dissolution. But this, of course, was not proof. A more fruitful idea was that a part of the instinct diverts toward the external world and manifests itself as the instinct of aggression and destructiveness. In this way, the instinct itself could serve eros in the sense that the organism destroys something else, animate or inanimate, rather than destroying itself. Conversely, any restriction of this outward-directed aggression would be aimed at increasing the self-destruction, which in all cases is already underway. At the same time, one can suspect from this example that the two types of instinct rarely appear, perhaps never isolated from one another, but that they combine with each other in varying proportions and very different ways, thus becoming unrecognizable. In sadism, long known as an instinct component of sexuality, we would thus have a particularly strong alliance between love tendencies and the destructive instinct, while its counterpart, masochism, would be a union between destruction directed inward and sexuality, a union that transforms what would otherwise be an imperceptible tendency into a conspicuous and tangible one. The hypothesis of the existence of a death or destruction instinct met with resistance, even within analytical circles. I'm aware that there is a frequent tendency to attribute what is dangerous and hostile in love to an original bipolarity in its own nature. At first, I only tentatively formulated the viewpoints I have developed here, but over time they have become so ingrained in me that I can no longer think otherwise. In my opinion, they are much more useful from a theoretical point of view than any other possible one, as they offer this simplification without ignoring or violating the facts, which is what we seek in scientific work. I know that in sadism and masochism, we have always seen before us manifestations of the destructive instinct, directed outward and inward, strongly allied with eroticism. But I no longer understand how we could have neglected the place of non-erotic aggressiveness and destructiveness, and failed to attribute to them the role they deserve in our interpretation of life. The desire for destruction, when directed inward, mostly escapes our perception, unless it is tinged with eroticism. I remember my own defensive attitude when the idea of a destruction instinct first appeared in the psychoanalytic literature, as well as the time it took for me to become receptive to it. That others have shown and continue to show the same attitude of rejection surprises me less, for young children do not like to be told about the innate human tendency toward malevolence, aggression and destructiveness, and thus also cruelty. God created them in his image and likeness of his own perfection. No one wants to be reminded of how difficult it is to reconcile the undeniable existence of evil, despite Christian protests, with his omnipotence and goodness. This would be the best excuse for God, as he would then play the same role of an economic discharge agent as the Jew in the ideal daily world. But it is still possible to attribute to God the existence of evil and the malevolence it embodies. In the face of these difficulties, each of us would do well to one day bow to the deeply moral nature of humanity. This will generally help us to be popular, and much will be forgiven us for it. In Goethe's Faust, we have an exceptionally convincing identification of the principle of evil with the destructive instinct, as all things of the void are deserving of destruction. Thus, everything you have called sin is actually a destruction mixed with evil. This is my own element. He himself names one of his adversaries not what is sacred and good, but the power of nature to create and multiply life, that is, eros. Air, water, and earth come together on two occasions. Water, earth, and air unfold. 1,000 germs arise and grow in dry and wet, in hot and cold. And if I did not have the reserved flame, it is because there is really nothing special on my part to show. The term libido can once again be used to describe the manifestations of the power of eros in order to distinguish them from the energy of the death instinct. It must be admitted that we have much more difficulty grasping this instinct, for we can only suspect it, as it were, as something in the background behind eros, eluding detection, unless its presence is betrayed by its alloy with eros. It is in sadism that the death instinct distorts the erotic goal in its own sense, but it fully satisfies the erotic impulse, where we come to obtain the clearest vision of its nature and its relationship with eros, even when it appears with no sexual purpose in the blindest fury of destructiveness. We cannot ignore that the satisfaction of the instinct is accompanied by an extraordinarily high degree of narcissistic pleasure, as it presents to the self a realization of ancient desires for omnipotence. This destruction instinct, moderated, domesticated, and, so to speak, individualized in its purpose, must, when directed toward objects, provide the self with the satisfaction of its vital needs and control over nature. Since the hypothesis of the existence of this instinct is based mainly on theoretical grounds, we must also admit that it is not entirely immune to theoretical objections. But this is the current state of our knowledge. Future research and reflections will undoubtedly shed more light to help resolve the question. In the following, I therefore adopt the view that the tendency toward aggression is an original, self-sufficient, instinctive disposition that humanity experiences. And I am still under the influence of this idea. I can now add that civilization is a process in service of eros, whose goal is to combine human individuals, first families, then races, peoples, and nations, into one great unity, that of humanity. We do not know why this must happen, but Eros's work is precisely this. These groups of people must be libidinally connected to each other, for the simple need and benefits of working together will not keep them united. But the natural aggressive instinct of man, the hostility of each against all and all against each, opposes this program of civilization. This aggressive instinct is the derivative and main representative of the death instinct we found alongside Eros, and with which it shares dominion over the world. I believe that now, in terms of the evolution of civilization, it no longer seems obscure. It must present itself as the struggle between Eros and death, between the instinct for life and the instinct for destruction, as it develops in the human species. This struggle is what essentially constitutes all of life, and the evolution of civilization can therefore be simply described as the struggle for the survival of the human species. And it is this battle of giants that our nurses try to soothe with their lullaby about heaven. And we can probably add with more precision a struggle for life in the form it was destined to take after a certain event that remains to be discovered. Chapter 7. Why do our animal parents not show this cultural struggle? We do not know. Most likely, some of them, like bees, ants, or termites, struggled for thousands of years before reaching state institutions. The distribution of functions and restrictions imposed on the individual, by which we admire them today, is a mark of our current condition. The fact that we know from our own feelings that we should not consider ourselves happy in any of these animal states, nor in any of the functions assigned to them, is notable. For other animal species, it is possible that a temporary balance between the influences of their environment and the mutually opposing instincts inside them was reached, resulting in a cessation of development. It is possible that in primitive humans, a new surge of libido triggered a renewed explosion of destructive instinct activity. There are many questions to which there is still no clear answer. Another question concerns us more directly. What means does civilization use to inhibit the aggression opposed to it, to make it harmless, or to get rid of it? We have already encountered some of these means, but not yet the one that seems to be the most important. This can be studied in the history of individual development. What happens for an individual's desire to aggression to become harmless? One very notable thing that we would never have guessed, but which is quite evident, is that its aggressiveness is introjected, internalized. In fact, it returns to the place from which it comes. That is, it is directed toward the self. There, it is assumed by a part of the self that opposes the rest of the self, in the form of the superego, and now in the form of conscience, is ready to act against the self. The same enduring aggressiveness that the self would have wanted to satisfy on other foreign individuals, the tension between the severe superego and the self that submits to it, is called by us the feeling of guilt, which manifests as a need for punishment. Civilization therefore gains control over the dangerous desire for aggression in the individual by weakening this desire through an internal agency, much like a garrison in a conquered city. As for the origin of the feeling of guilt, the analyst has different opinions from those of other psychologists, but even for him, it is not easy to account for. To begin with, if we ask how a person comes to have a feeling of guilt, we get an answer that is difficult to discuss. A person feels guilty, or the devout would say sinful, when they have done something they know to be wrong. But then we realize that this answer tells us little. Perhaps after some hesitation we add that even when someone has not actually done something wrong but only recognized an intention to do so, they can consider themselves guilty. The question then arises, why is the intention considered equivalent to the act? However, both cases assume that one has already recognized that what is wrong is probable and something that should not be carried out. How does one come to this judgment? We can reject the existence of an original, so to speak, natural capacity to distinguish right from wrong. What is wrong is often not at all what is harmful or dangerous to the self. On the contrary, it may be something desirable and pleasant for the self. Thus, there is an external influence acting here, and it is this influence that decides what must be classified as good or bad. Since a person's own feelings would not have led them down this path, there must have been a motive to submit to this external influence. This motive is easily discovered in its intensity and dependence on others. The best way to designate it is as a fear of losing love. If one loses the love of a person on whom they depend, one also ceases to be protected from various dangers. Especially, one is exposed to the risk that this stronger person will assert their superiority in the form of punishment. Thus, initially, what is wrong is what exposes one to the loss of love. Out of fear of this loss, it must be avoided. This is also why it matters little whether one has already committed the wrong act or merely intends to do so. In both cases, the danger only presents itself if and when the authority finds out. In each of these cases, the authority would behave in the same way. The state of mind we are describing is called bad conscience, but in reality, this name is not justified. At this stage, the feeling of guilt is clearly just a fear of losing love, a social anxiety. In young children, it can only be something else, but in many adults as well, it has only changed until the place of the father or both parents is occupied by the human community in general. As a result, these people usually allow themselves to do anything that is wrong, as long as it promises them pleasure, as long as they are sure the authority will not find out or be able to blame them for it. They only fear being discovered. The current society must generally rely on this state of mind. A major change occurs only when the authority becomes internalized through the establishment of the superego. Then the phenomena of conscience reach a higher level. In reality, it is only at this point that we must speak of conscience or a sense of guilt. It is also at this point that the fear of being discovered ends, and the distinction between doing something wrong and wanting to do it completely disappears, because nothing can escape the superego, not even thoughts. It is true that the severity of the situation from a real point of view has disappeared, since the new authority, the superego, has no known motive to mistreat the self with which it is intimately connected. But the genetic influence that preserves what is past and exceeded is felt in the fact that, fundamentally, things remain as they were at the beginning. The superego torments the sinful self with the same feeling of anxiety and watches for opportunities to have it punished by the outside world. In this second stage of development, conscience presents a particularity that was absent in the first stage and which no longer requires explanation. In fact, the more virtuous a man is, the more severe and distrustful his behavior becomes, so that in the end, it is precisely those who have pushed holiness the furthest who reproach the most sins. This means that virtue loses part of its promised reward. The docile and controlled self does not benefit from the trust of its mentor and seems to make vain efforts to acquire it. The objection will be immediately that these difficulties are superficial, and it will be said that a stricter and more vigilant conscience is precisely the hallmark of a moral man. Moreover, when the saints call themselves sinners, they are not wrong to consider the instinctual temptations they are exposed to in a special measure, because, as is well known, temptations only increase constant frustration, while occasional satisfaction of the same temptations makes them diminish, at least for a time. Another fact is that bad luck, that is, extreme frustration, increases the power of conscience in the superego. As long as things are going well for a man, his conscience is indulgent and allows the self to carry out all kinds of activities. But when misfortune strikes, it scrutinizes his soul, recognizes his sinfulness, raises the demands of his conscience, imposes abstinences, and punishes itself with penances. Entire peoples have acted this way and continue to do so. However, this can easily be explained by the original infantile stage of conscience, which, as we see, is not abandoned after introjection into the superego, but persists with it and behind it. Fate is considered a substitute for paternal agency. If a father is unfortunate, it means that he is no longer loved by this supreme power, and being threatened by such a loss of love, he once again bows before the paternal representative in his superego, a representative he is ready to neglect in times of good fortune. This becomes particularly clear when one considers fate in the strictly religious sense. As an expression of the divine will, the people of Israel believed themselves to be God's chosen son, and when the Great Father sent misfortune upon his people, they never questioned their belief in their relationship with him or his power or righteousness. Rather, they produced prophets who exposed their sinfulness and, from this feeling of guilt, created the excessively strict commandments of their priestly religion. It is remarkable to see how a primitive man behaves differently. If he experiences misfortune, he does not blame himself, but blames his fetish, which apparently has not fulfilled its duty, and gives it correction rather than punishing himself. Thus, we know of two origins of the feeling of guilt, one that emerges from the fear of an authority, and the other, later, that emerges from the fear of the superego. The first emphasizes renouncing instinctual satisfactions, while the second, in addition to that, pushes one to punish oneself, because the continuation of forbidden desires cannot be hidden from the superego. We have also learned how to understand the severity of the superego and the demands of conscience. It is simply a continuation of the extreme authority's severity that it has succeeded and partly replaced. We now see the relationship between instinct renunciation and the feeling of guilt. Originally, the renunciation of instinct was the result of the fear of external authority. One renounced satisfactions in order not to lose love. If one has made this renunciation, one is, so to speak, at peace with the authority, and there should be no remaining feeling of guilt. But with the fear of the superego, the situation is different. Here, instinct renunciation is not enough, as the desire persists and cannot be hidden from the superego. Thus, despite the renunciation, a feeling of guilt arises. This constitutes a major economic disadvantage in the elevation of a superego, or as we might say, in the formation of a conscience. Instinct renunciation no longer has a fully liberating effect, and virtuous continence is no longer rewarded by the security of love. External misfortune, the loss of love, and punishment by external authority have been replaced by a permanent internal misfortune, by the tension of guilt. These interrelations are so complicated, and at the same time so important that, at the risk of repeating myself, I will approach them from a different angle. The chronological sequence would be as follows. First comes the renunciation of instinct due to the fear of external authority's aggression, which is equivalent to the fear of losing love, as love is a protection against this punitive aggression. Then the elevation of an internal authority occurs, and instinct renunciation happens out of fear of it, out of fear of conscience. In this second situation, bad intentions are equivalent to bad actions, and it is here that the feeling of guilt and the need for punishment arise. The aggressiveness of conscience maintains the aggressiveness of authority up to this point, and so far, things are clear. But where does the compelling influence of misfortune, the externally imposed renunciation, and the extraordinary severity of conscience in the best and most docile people fit in? We have already explained these two peculiarities of conscience, but we probably still have the impression that these explanations do not address the heart of the matter and leave an unsolved residue. It is here that a concept which belongs entirely to psychoanalysis and is foreign to the ordinary way of thinking comes into play. This idea can help us understand why the subject seems so confused and obscure, as it tells us that conscience, or more precisely, the anxiety that later transforms into conscience, is actually the cause of initial instinct renunciation. But later the relationship reverses. Each renunciation of instinct now becomes a dynamic source of conscience, and each new renunciation increases its severity and intolerance. If we could better harmonize this with what we already know about the history of conscience's origin, we might be tempted to defend the paradoxical assertion that trust is the result of instinct renunciation, or that externally imposed instinct renunciation creates the conscience that then demands new instinct renunciations. The contradiction between this assertion and what we previously said about the genesis of conscience is, in reality, not so great, and we see a way to reduce it even further to make our presentation easier. Let's take the aggressive instinct as an example and assume that the renunciation in question is always a renunciation of aggression. The effect of instinct renunciation on conscience is then that each part of aggression that the subject renounces is assumed by the superego and increases its aggressiveness toward the ego. This does not fit well with the opinion that the original aggressiveness of conscience is a continuation of the severity of external authority and therefore has nothing to do with renunciation. But the divergence is eliminated if we postulate a different derivation for this first segment of the superego's aggressiveness in the child. A considerable amount of aggression against authority must develop, preventing it from satisfying its initial desires, but no less important, whatever type of instinctual deprivation is imposed. However, it must renounce the satisfaction of this vengeful aggression. It finds a way out of this economically difficult situation through known mechanisms. Through identification, it appropriates the unassailable authority. This then becomes its superego and takes possession of all the aggression a child would have wanted to direct against it. The child's ego must settle for the sad role of authority, with the father thus degraded. Here, as so often, the actual situation is reversed. If I were the father and you the child, I should mistreat you. The relationship between the superego and the ego is a distorted return of the desire for real relationships between the still undivided ego and an external object. This is also typical, but the essential difference is that the original severity of the superego does not represent, or not as much the severity it experienced from it or attributed to it, but rather the aggression toward it. If this is correct, we can actually assert that, at the beginning, conscience arises from the suppression of an aggressive impulse, and then it strengthens with new suppressions of the same type. Which of these two perspectives is correct? The previous one, which seemed genetically irrefutable, or the more recent one, which completes the theory so satisfactorily and clearly, and with the evidence of direct observation. Both are justified, they do not contradict each other, and they even coincide at one point. The vengeful aggression of the child is partly determined by the amount of punitive aggression they expect from their father. However, experience shows that the severity of the superego developed by the child does not correspond at all to the severity of the treatment they themselves received. The severity of one seems independent of that of the other. A child who was raised with much indulgence can develop a very strict conscience. But it would also be wrong to exaggerate this independence. It is not difficult to convince oneself that the severity of upbringing also strongly influences the formation of the child's superego. What this means is that in the formation of the superego and the emergence of conscience, both innate constitutional factors and real environmental influences act together. This is not at all surprising. On the contrary, it is an etiological universal condition for all these processes. It can also be asserted that when a child reacts to their first major instinctual frustrations with excessive aggression, and as a result a severe superego, they follow a phylogenetic model. This would explain the currently justified response. Indeed, the prehistoric father was undoubtedly terrifying, and external aggression can be attributed to him. Thus, moving from individual development to phylogenetic development, the differences between the two theories of the origin of conscience are further reduced. On the other hand, a new and important difference appears between these two developmental processes. We cannot move away from the hypothesis that the human feeling of guilt originates from the Oedipus complex and was acquired at the moment of the father's murder by the brothers gathered together. On this occasion, an act of aggression was not suppressed, but was actually carried out. However, this is the same act of aggression whose suppression in the child is supposed to be the source of their feeling of guilt. At this point, it would not be surprising to hear the listener exclaim in anger, "Then it doesn't matter whether the father was killed or not, because one feels guilty in either case." We would like to raise a few doubts here. Either it is not true that the feeling of guilt comes from repressed aggression, or the entire story of the murder of the father is a fiction, and the children of primitive man did not kill their parents more often than modern children. Moreover, if this is not a fiction but a plausible piece of history, it would be an event that everyone would expect to occur. That is, a person feels guilty because they have actually done something that cannot be justified, and for this event, which ultimately is a daily occurrence, analysis has not yet provided an explanation. This is true, but we must fill in this gap. There is also no great secret in the matter. When someone feels guilty after committing a reprehensible act, and because of that, the feeling should be more properly called remorse. It only refers to a fact that has been realized, and of course presupposes that the conscience, the position of feeling guilty, already existed before the act was carried out. Therefore, such remorse can never help us discover the origin of conscience and the feeling of guilt in general. What usually happens in these everyday cases is the following. An instinctual need acquires the necessary strength to obtain satisfaction despite the conscience, which is, after all, limited in its power. And with the natural weakening of the need after being satisfied, the previous balance of power is restored. Psychoanalysis justifies itself by excluding from discussion the case of a feeling of guilt due to remorse, however frequent these cases may be and regardless of their practical importance. But if the human feeling of guilt traces back to the murder of the primal father, then after all, it was a case of remorse. We must expose that, at that moment, conscience and the feeling of guilt did not exist as we had previously assumed before the act. If this is not the case, where do the remorse in this case come from? There is no doubt that this case should explain to us the secret of the feeling of guilt and resolve our difficulties, and I believe it does. This remorse was the result of the primary ambivalence of the children's feelings toward their parents. They hated them, but also loved them. After their hatred was satisfied by their act of aggression, their love came to the forefront in their remorse for the deed. This set the superego in motion by identification with the father, giving it the father's power as if it were a punishment for the aggressive act they had committed against him, and created the restrictions meant to prevent a repetition of the act. And as the inclination toward aggression against the father repeats in subsequent generations, the feeling of guilt also persists and strengthens for each piece of repressed aggression transferred to the ego. Now, I believe we can finally understand two perfectly clear things: the role love plays in the origin of conscience and the inevitable fatality of the feeling of guilt. Whether one killed their father or refrained from doing so is not really what is decisive. What is decisive is that one is forced to feel guilty in either case. Indeed, the feeling of guilt is an expression of the conflict caused by the ambivalence of the eternal struggle between the tendencies of love and destruction or death. This conflict is triggered as soon as humans are faced with the task of living together. As long as the community does not take any form other than that of the family, the conflict is destined to express itself in the Oedipus complex, to establish conscience and to create the first feeling of guilt. When trying to expand the community, the same conflict may continue in forms that depend on the practice and, if reinforced, may lead to an increased intensification of the feeling of guilt. As civilization obeys an internal erotic drive that pushes human beings to group together closely, it can only achieve this goal by increasingly strengthening the feeling of guilt. What began in relation to the father completes itself in relation to the group. If civilization is a necessary course of development from the family to humanity as a whole, then, due to the inherent conflict that arises from the ambivalence of the eternal struggle between the tendencies of love and death, it is probably inextricably linked to a problem of the feeling of guilt, which could reach levels that the individual finds difficult to bear. In these situations, one recalls the moving plea of the great poet against the celestial powers: "You bring us to guilt, you leave us without attention, then let remorse torture us fiercely, a moment of guilt, an era of misery, and we can sigh in relief, thinking that nonetheless it is granted to a few to save themselves without making great effort, to save themselves from the whirlwind of their own feelings, from the deepest truths to which the rest of us must find our way through tearing uncertainty and anxious searching." Chapter 8. Upon reaching the end of his journey, the author must ask for forgiveness from his listeners for not having been a more skillful guide and for not sparing them certain stretches of the road that were empty or filled with boring detours. There is no doubt that he could have done better. He will try to rectify certain things in the end. First, I suspect that the audience feels that our discussions about the meaning of guilt destabilize the framework of this essay, occupying too much space, so that the rest of its theme, which is not always closely related, is set aside. This may have spoiled the structure of my essay, but it faithfully corresponds to my intention of representing the feeling of guilt as the most important problem in the development of civilization, and demonstrating that the price we pay for our progress in civilization is a loss of happiness due to the increase in the feeling of guilt. Anything that still seems strange in this statement, which is the final conclusion of our research, can probably be attributed to the quite particular, still completely unexplained relationship that the feeling of guilt has with our conscience. In the common case of remorse, which we consider normal, this feeling is clearly perceptible to the conscience. Indeed, we are used to talking about the conscience of guilt rather than just the feeling of guilt. Thus, conscience makes us all cowards. That today's education hides from young people the role that sexuality will play in their lives is not the only reproach we are compelled to make. Its other sin is that it does not prepare them for the aggression they are destined to face. By sending young people into life with such a misguided psychological orientation, education behaves as if it were preparing someone for a polar expedition with summer clothes and maps of Italian lakes. It then becomes obvious that there is a misapplication of ethical demands. The severity of these demands would not cause as much harm if education simply said, "Here is how men must be in order to be happy and make others happy." But one must rely on the fact that they are not like that. Instead, young people are made to believe that everyone adheres to ethical demands, meaning that everyone is virtuous. It is on this basis that the requirement for young people to also be virtuous rests. Our study of neurosis, to which we owe the most valuable inclinations for understanding normal conditions, confronts us with some contradictions. In one of these afflictions, obsessive neurosis, the feeling of guilt loudly makes itself known to the conscience. It dominates the clinical picture and the patient's life, hardly allowing anything else to appear alongside it. But in most other cases and forms of neurosis, the feeling of guilt remains entirely unconscious, without producing less significant effects. Our patients do not believe us when we attribute an unconscious feeling of guilt to them. To make ourselves intelligible to them, we speak to them of an unconscious need for punishment in which the feeling of guilt is expressed. But this relationship with a specific form of neurosis should not be overvalued. Even in obsessive neurosis, there are types of patients who are not aware of their feeling of guilt or only experience it as an unsettling discomfort, a sort of anxiety, if they are prevented from carrying out certain actions. It should be possible to understand these things, but we are not there yet. Perhaps we will be pleased to note that the feeling of guilt is actually just a topography of anxiety, and that in its later phases it completely coincides with the fear of the superego. Moreover, the relationships between anxiety and conscience exhibit the same extraordinary variations. Anxiety is always present somewhere behind each symptom, but at one point it seizes the entire consciousness loudly, while at another point it is so hidden that we are forced to speak of unconscious anxiety, or if we want a clearer psychological understanding, since anxiety is primarily just a feeling of the possibilities of anxiety. As a result, it is conceivable that the feeling of guilt produced by civilization is not perceived as such and remains largely unconscious, appearing rather as a kind of discomfort, a dissatisfaction for which one seeks other motivations. In any case, religions have never neglected the role that the feeling of guilt plays in civilization. This is a point I have not sufficiently appreciated elsewhere. They seek to redeem humanity from this feeling of guilt, which they call sin. Thus, in Christianity, this redemption is achieved through the sacrificial death of one person who assumes the common guilt of all. From this, we may deduce what the first occasion was when this primordial guilt was acquired, also marking the beginning of civilization, although this may not be of great importance. It may not be superficial to clarify the meaning of certain words such as conscience, feeling of guilt, need for punishment, and remorse, which we may have used too imprecisely and interchangeably. All these terms refer to the same state of affairs but designate different aspects of it. The superego is an organism inferred by us, and conscience is a function that we attribute, among other things, to this organism. This function consists of monitoring the actions and intentions of the ego, judging them, and from that, exercising censorship. The feeling of guilt, the severity of the superego, is thus the same as the severity of conscience. It is the perception that the ego is being watched. In this way, the evaluation of the tension between its own efforts and the demands of the superego, the fear of this critical instance, is at the heart of every relationship. The need for punishment is an instinctive manifestation of the ego, which has become masochistic under the influence of a sadistic superego, that is, a portion of the internal destruction instinct present in the ego used to form an attachment to the superego. We should only speak of conscience when the existence of the superego is demonstrated. As for the feeling of guilt, we must admit that it exists before the superego, and therefore also before conscience. At that moment, the immediate expression of the fear of external authority is a recognition of the tension between the ego and this authority. It is the direct derivation of the conflict between the need for love from authority and the impulse toward instinctual satisfaction, the inhibition of which produces the inclination toward aggression. The superposition of these two layers of the feeling of guilt, one earlier related to the fear of external authority and the other to the fear of internal authority, has complicated our understanding of the position of conscience in several ways. Remorse is a general term for the ego's reaction in a case of the feeling of guilt and contains, in an unmodified form, the sensory material of anxiety that operates behind the feeling of guilt. This in itself constitutes a punishment and may include the need for punishment. Thus, remorse may also be older than conscience. It will not hurt to review once again the contradictions that, for a time, left us puzzled during our investigation. At one point, the feeling of guilt was the consequence of aggressive acts that had been refrained from, but at another point, precisely at the historical beginning of the murder of the father, it was the consequence of an aggressive act actually committed. However, a solution to this difficulty was found through the institution of internal authority, the superego, which radically altered the situation. Before, the feeling of guilt coincided with remorse. We can even observe that the term remorse should be reserved for the reaction after an act has been accomplished. From that moment on, due to the omnipotence of the superego, the the distinction between intentional aggression and actually committed aggression lost its importance. From then on, the feeling of guilt could arise, not only for an act of violence actually carried out, as everyone knows, but also for an act merely intended, as psychoanalysis discovered. Regardless of this alteration of the psychological situation, the conflict arising from ambivalence that between the two primary instincts gives the same result. We are tempted to seek the solution here to the problem of the variable relationship between the feeling of guilt and conscience. One might think that the feeling of guilt that arises from remorse for a wrong act must always be conscious, while the feeling of guilt that arises from the perception of a bad impulse may remain unconscious. The answer is not so simple. Obsessive neurosis speaks energetically against this hypothesis. The second contradiction concerns the aggressive energy that is supposed to be that of the superego. From one perspective, this energy is limited to transmitting the punitive energy of external authority and keeping it alive in the mind, while from another perspective, it represents, on the contrary, the unused aggressive energy now directed against this inhibiting authority. The first perspective seemed to better fit the historical narrative, while the second aligned more with the theory of guilt. A more detailed examination has almost completely resolved this seemingly irreconcilable contradiction. What remains as an essential and common factor in each case is, in both instances, an aggressiveness that has been internalized. Clinical observation also allows us to distinguish two sources for the aggressiveness we attribute to the superego. One or the other exerts the greatest effect in any given case, but as a general rule, they operate together. I believe it is time to seriously consider a point of view I have already recommended for provisional acceptance in the most recent analytical literature. There seems to be a preference for the idea that any type of frustration, any frustrated instinctual satisfaction, leads to or may lead to an increase in the feeling of guilt. I believe that a significant theoretical simplification will be achieved if we consider that this applies only to aggressive instincts, and there will be few elements to contradict this hypothesis. For how can we explain, from a dynamic and economic perspective, the emergence of an increase in the feeling of guilt rather than an unsatisfied erotic demand? This seems only possible indirectly if we assume that the expectation of erotic satisfaction invokes a share of aggressiveness against the person who interfered with that satisfaction, in addition to the fact that this aggressiveness must also be suppressed. But if this is the case, it is only the aggressiveness that transforms into a feeling of guilt when it is repressed and entrusted to the superego. I am convinced that many processes will admit a simpler and clearer explanation if psychoanalysis's discoveries about the derivation of the feeling of guilt are limited to aggressive instincts. The examination of clinical material does not give us a clear answer here because, as our hypothesis suggests, the two types of instincts almost always appear mixed and rarely pure and isolated from each other. However, an investigation into extreme cases would probably point in the direction I anticipate. I am tempted to draw an initial advantage from this narrower view of the case by applying it to the process of repression. As we have learned, neurotic symptoms are essentially substitute satisfactions for unsatisfied sexual desires. During our analytical work, we have been surprised to discover that perhaps all neuroses conceal a share of unconscious guilt, which in turn strengthens the symptoms by using them as punishment. It now seems plausible to formulate the following proposition. When an instinctual drive suffers repression, its libidinal elements transform into symptoms, and its aggressive components into a feeling of guilt. Although this proposition is only an imperfect approximation of the truth, it deserves our attention. Some listeners of this work may also feel they have heard the formula of the conflict between the hero and the death instinct too often. It has been suggested that the latter characterizes the process of civilization that humanity experiences, but it has also been related to the development of the individual and has been added that it reveals a secret of organic life in general. I believe we cannot avoid examining the relationships between these three processes. The repetition of the same formula is justified by the fact that both the process of human civilization and the process of individual development are also vital processes, meaning they must share the most general characteristic of life. On the other hand, the evidence of the presence of this general characteristic does not help us, due to its general nature, to differentiate the processes, especially as long as they are not specified by special qualifications. Therefore, we can only be satisfied if we affirm that the process of civilization is a modification that the vital process undergoes under the influence of a task imposed by the hero and prompted by necessity, by the demands of reality, and that this task is to unite separated individuals into a community united by libidinal bonds. However, when we examine the realization between the process of human civilization and the process of development or education of individual humans, we will conclude with little doubt that both are of a similar nature, if not the same process applied to different types of objects. The process of civilization of the human species is, of course, an abstraction at a higher level compared to the development of the individual, and thus more difficult to grasp concretely. We should not push analogies to an obsessive extreme, but given the similarity of goals between the two processes, in one case, the integration of a separated individual into a human group, and in the other, the creation of a unified group from many individuals, it is not surprising to find similarities between the means employed and the resulting phenomena. Given their exceptional importance, we should not delay mentioning a characteristic that distinguishes the two processes. In the process of individual development, the pleasure principles program, consisting of finding happiness, remains the main goal. Integration into a human community or adaptation to it appears as a barely avoidable condition that must be fulfilled before achieving the goal of happiness. If this could be done without this condition, it might perhaps be preferable. In other words, individual development seems to us to be the product of the interaction between two impulses, the impulse toward happiness, which we generally call selfish, and the impulse toward union with others within the community, which we call altruistic. None of these descriptions goes much further than the surface. In the process of individual development, as we have said, the primary emphasis is on the selfish impulse or the impulse for happiness, while the other impulse, which can be described as cultural, generally takes on the role of imposing restrictions. In the process of civilization, things are different. Here, the most important aspect by far is the goal of creating unity among individual human beings. It is true that the goal of happiness remains present, but it takes a back seat. It almost seems that the creation of a human community would succeed better if there were no need to pay attention to the happiness of the individual. As one might expect, the process of individual development has its own characteristics that do not reproduce in the process of human civilization, only insofar as the former process aims for union with the community. It is therefore necessary that it coincides with the second process, just as a planet revolves around a central body while rotating on its own axis. The individual participates in the development of humanity while following their own path in life. However, from our boring perspective, the play of forces in the sky seems frozen in an immutable order. In the realm of organic life, we can still observe how forces compete with each other and how the effects of the conflict change continuously. Likewise, the two impulses, one toward personal happiness and the other toward union with other human beings, must contend within each individual. Thus, the two processes of individual development and cultural development must confront each other in a hostile manner and fight for ground. But this struggle between the individual and society is not a derivation of the probably irreconcilable contradiction between the hero's primal instincts and the death instinct, but a dispute within the economy of libido comparable to the relative struggle for the distribution of libido between the ego and objects. Moreover, it allows for eventual accommodation in the individual, and as one might expect, it will also do so in the future of civilization. Just as the latter oppresses the individual's life today, the analogy between the process of civilization and the path of individual development can be meaningfully employed. One could argue that the community also develops a superego, under whose influence cultural development unfolds. It would be tempting for anyone familiar with human civilizations to follow this analogy in detail. I will content myself with outlining a few key points. The superego of an era of civilization has a similar origin to that of an individual. It is based on the impression left by the personalities of great leaders, men with overwhelming mental strength, or those in whom one of the human impulses found its strongest and purest expression, and therefore often its most one-sided expression. In many cases, the analogy goes further, as throughout their lives these figures were often, though not always, ridiculed and mistreated by others, even cruelly despised. Indeed, the primitive father did not attain divinity until long after his violent death. The most striking example of this fateful conjunction can be found in the figure of Jesus Christ, unless this figure is part of the mythology that created him from a vague memory of this primal event. Another point of convergence between the cultural and individual superego is that the former, just like the latter, establishes strict ideal demands, disobedience to which is punished by the fear of conscience. Indeed, we encounter the remarkable circumstance that the mental processes in question seem actually more familiar and accessible to consciousness when seen at the group level than in the isolated individual. When tension arises, it is only the aggressiveness of the superego, in the form of reproaches, that is loudly heard, while its real demands often remain deeply unconscious. If we bring them to consciousness, we discover that they coincide with the precepts of the dominant cultural superego. At this point, the two processes, that of the cultural development of the group and that of the cultural development of the individual, are, so to speak, always intertwined. This is why certain manifestations and properties of the superego can be more easily detected in its behavior within the cultural community than in the isolated individual. The cultural superego has developed its ideals and established its demands. Among these are those concerning the relationships between human beings, which are grouped under the title of ethics. At all times, people have attributed great value to ethics, as if they expected it to produce particularly important results. Indeed, it is a subject that can easily be recognized as the most painful point of any civilization. Ethics must therefore be seen as a therapeutic attempt and as an effort to achieve, through the control of the superego, something that has not yet been attained by any other cultural activity. As we already know, the problem we are faced with is to rid ourselves of the greatest obstacle to civilization, namely, the constitutional tendency of humans to be aggressive toward one another. For this same reason, we are particularly interested in what is probably the most recent of the cultural commandments of the superego, the commandment to love thy neighbor as thyself. In our search and therapy of neuroses, we are led to make two reproaches against the individual's superego. First, in the severity of its commandments and prohibitions, it cares too little about the happiness of the ego, as it does not take into account sufficiently the resistance opposing their obedience, both from the instinctive force of the ego and the difficulties presented by the real external environment. As a result, we are often forced, for therapeutic purposes, to oppose the superego and seek to reduce its demands. The same objections can be made against the ethical demands of the cultural superego. Indeed, it does not sufficiently concern itself with the facts regarding the mental constitution of human beings. It gives an order and does not ask whether people can obey. On the contrary, it assumes that the human ego is psychologically capable of everything, that it has unlimited control. This is a mistake, and even in what are called normal people, the ego cannot be controlled beyond certain limits. If more is demanded of a person, it will produce rebellion, neurosis, or make them unhappy. The commandment, love thy neighbor as thyself, is the strongest defense against human aggressiveness and an excellent example of the non-psychological procedures of the cultural superego. The commandment is impossible to fulfill, because such an inflation of love can only diminish its value without freeing us from difficulties. Civilization does not take this into account, and contentedly admonishes us by saying that the more difficult it is to observe the precept, the more meritorious it is to do so. But the one who follows such a precept in the current civilization simply finds themselves disadvantaged compared to the one who ignores it. What an obstacle to civilization must aggression be if the defense against it can cause as much misery as aggression itself? The so-called natural ethics has nothing to offer here, except the narcissistic satisfaction of believing oneself to be better than others. At this point, ethics based on religion introduces its promises of a better life after death. But as long as virtue is not rewarded here on earth, ethics seems to preach in vain. I also believe that a real change in the relationships between human beings and possessions would be more useful in this area than any ethical precept. However, the awareness of this fact among socialists has been obscured and rendered useless for practical purposes by a new, erroneous, idealistic conception of human nature. I think the line of thought that attempts to trace the role played by a superego in the phenomena of cultural development still promises more discoveries. However, I hasten to conclude, but there is one question I cannot avoid. If the development of civilization is so similar to the development of the individual and uses the same methods, should we not be justified in concluding that, due to cultural impulses, some civilizations or certain periods of civilization, or even all of humanity, have become neurotic? An analytical dissection of such neuroses could lead to therapeutic recommendations with great practical interest. I would not say that such an attempt to apply psychoanalysis to the cultural community is absurd or doomed to failure, but one would need to be very cautious and not forget that in the end it is only analogies and that it is dangerous, not only with people, but also with concepts, to tear them from the domain in which they were originally created and evolved. Furthermore, the diagnosis of community neuroses faces a particular difficulty. In an individual neurosis, we take as our starting point the contrast that distinguishes the patient from their supposed normal environment. But for a group whose members are affected by the same disorder, such a background might not exist. It would then need to be found elsewhere. As for the therapeutic application of our knowledge, what would be the point of the most correct analysis of social neuroses if no one has the authority to impose this therapy on the group? Despite all these difficulties, we can hope that one day someone will dare to undertake a pathology of cultural communities. For various reasons, it is far from my intention to express an opinion on the value of human civilization. I have tried to distance myself from the enthusiastic prejudice that supports the idea that our civilization is the most precious jewel we possess or could acquire, and that its path will necessarily lead us to unimaginable levels of perfection. I cannot listen without indignation to those who assert that the goals of culture and the means employed to achieve them are inherently valuable. All this seems possible to me only in a state of affairs that the individual would be unable to tolerate impartially. This is facilitated by the fact that I know very little about all of this. I know one thing, that human value judgments are the direct consequence of their desires for happiness, and are therefore an attempt to support their illusions with arguments. It would seem very understandable to me if someone emphasized the inevitability of the course of human civilization, and said, for example, that tendencies such as the restriction of sexual life or the establishment of a humanitarian ideal at the expense of natural selection are inevitable developmental trends to which it is better to submit, as if they were necessities of nature. I am also aware of the objection that could be made against this, namely that in human history, such tendencies, considered insurmountable, have often been abandoned and replaced by others. Thus, I do not have the courage to stand before my fellow men as a prophet, and I bow to their reproach for being unable to offer them any comfort, for at bottom, this is what all revolutionaries demand, as wild and passionate as the most virtuous believers. The fateful question for the human species seems to me to be whether, in its cultural development, it will succeed in dominating the disruption of its community life caused by the human instinct of aggression and self-destruction. Perhaps in this precise sense, the current era deserves particular attention. Men have succeeded in mastering the forces of nature to the point that with their help, they would have no difficulty exterminating themselves to the last man. They know this, and it is a large part of their current malaise, their misery, and their state of anxiety. And now, one can hope that the other of the two celestial powers, the eternal hero, will strive to impose itself in the struggle with its equally immortal adversary. But who can predict with what success, and what the outcome will be?